On July 2nd, 1937, a silver Lockheed Electra vanished somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. Inside were two people who had captured the world's imagination. Amelia Earhart, the most famous aviator of her generation, and Fred Noonan, a navigator who had charted routes across oceans for Pan American Airways. They were attempting something no one had done before a 29,000-mile flight around the world at the equator. With just 7,000 miles remaining, they disappeared without a trace. No wreckage was ever confirmed. No bodies were ever found. For nearly 90 years, researchers, historians, and explorers have searched for answers in one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. Tonight, we'll walk through every detail of that final flight, examine the theories that have emerged, and explore the clues that still surface today. This is the story of Amelia Earhart's last journey. Amelia Mary Earhart was born on July 24, 1897, in Atchison, Kansas, into a world that told women what they could and couldn't do. But from childhood, she refused those boundaries. She collected newspaper clippings of women in male-dominated fields, built homemade ramps to simulate flight, and attended air shows that left her mesmerized by the mechanics of powered flight. Her first ride in an airplane came in 1920, and she later said she knew within minutes that she had to fly. By 1928, she became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic as a passenger, a feat that made her an international celebrity overnight. That passenger flight changed everything. On June 17th, 1928, Earhart sat in the cabin of a Fokker F-7 named Friendship as pilot Wilma Stultz navigated through fog and storms across the Atlantic. She kept the flight log, monitored fuel consumption, and assisted with navigation, but she wasn't at the controls. When they landed in Wales after 20 hours and 40 minutes in the air, the press swarmed around her, largely ignoring the male pilots who had actually flown the plane. Earhart later described herself as nothing more than a sack of potatoes on that flight cargo that happened to be female. The attention was overwhelming and, to Earhart, undeserved. Lecture tours, book deals, and product endorsements followed. She became the face of a women's clothing line, promoted luggage, and appeared in advertisements for everything from Lucky Strike cigarettes to motor oil. The commercial opportunities provided income that would later fund her flying ambitions, but the celebrity felt hollow. She had done nothing but sit in an airplane while men flew it. The world celebrated her for being present, not for being capable. Her childhood had prepared her for this frustration. Growing up, she had been a tomboy who climbed trees, hunted rats with a rifle, and kept a scrapbook of women who succeeded in engineering, law, advertising, and management. Her parents encouraged her curiosity, though her father's alcoholism created financial instability that forced the family to move frequently. She attended 6 different high schools, never quite fitting in. Always the outsider who asked too many questions and refused to accept that certain paths were closed to her simply because she was female. During World War I, she worked as a nurse's aide in Toronto, caring for wounded soldiers. She watched Royal Flying Corps pilots take off from a nearby airfield and felt drawn to the mechanics and freedom of flight. After the war, she enrolled at Columbia University to study medicine. But the pull of aviation proved stronger than academic ambition. She saved money from odd jobs, truck driver, photographer, stenographer, until she had enough for flying lessons. Her instructor was Anita Netta Snook, one of the few female pilots in America. Earhart showed up for her first lesson, wearing a leather jacket she deliberately slept in for 3 nights to make it look worn and authentic. She cut her hair short to match other female aviators. Everything about her presentation was calculated to be taken seriously in a world that viewed women pilots as novelties or publicity stunts. Within 6 months, she had purchased her own plane, a yellow Kinner Airster biplane she named the Canary. By 1922, she had set her first aviation record, reaching an altitude of 14,000 feet, the highest any woman had flown at that time. But it wasn't enough. Records meant nothing if they were qualified with "for a woman." She wanted to prove herself on the same terms as men, to be judged by the same standards and found equally capable. The 1,928 Atlantic crossing as a passenger had made her famous. Now she needed to earn that fame through her own skill and courage. The question was how far she was willing to go to prove it. Earhart didn't want to be known simply as a passenger. In 1932, she flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean, becoming the first woman to do so and only the second person after Charles Lindbergh. The flight took nearly 15 hours through storms, ice, and mechanical failures. She landed in a pasture in Northern Ireland, startling a farmhand who had no idea he was meeting one of the most famous people in the world. The solo crossing earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross and cemented her status as aviation royalty. But for Earhart, it was never about fame. It was about proving that women belonged in the cockpit. She departed from Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, on May 20th, 1932, exactly 5 years after Lindbergh's historic flight. The timing was deliberate. She wanted the world to make the comparison. Her aircraft was a single-engine Lockheed Vega painted bright red, loaded with extra fuel tanks that left little room for anything else. She carried a thermos of soup, a can of tomato juice, and chocolate bars. No radio operator, no co-pilot, no support crew. Just her, the engine, and 2,000 miles of open ocean. The flight began smoothly, but conditions deteriorated rapidly after dark. Ice began forming on the wings, adding weight and disrupting the airflow that kept the plane aloft. The altimeter failed, leaving her uncertain of her exact altitude. Flames began shooting from a crack in the engine manifold, visible even in daylight, casting an orange glow across the instrument panel in the darkness. Any one of these problems could have justified turning back. Together, they created a situation where most pilots would have ditched the aircraft in the ocean and hoped for rescue. Earhart pushed forward. She flew through rain so heavy it felt like the plane was underwater. Lightning illuminated massive storm clouds that rose like mountains around her. The Vega bucked and shuddered in turbulence that threw her against the restraints hard enough to leave bruises. She descended to avoid the worst of the icing, flying just 200 feet above the wave tops, close enough to see whitecaps in the darkness below. The roar of wind and engine was deafening. A constant assault that made thinking difficult and precise navigation nearly impossible. 13 hours into the flight, fuel began leaking into the cockpit, the smell of gasoline mixing with engine fumes until she felt lightheaded and nauseous. The manifold crack had worsened, and she could see flames licking along the engine cowling. She calculated fuel consumption against distance remaining, and realized she wouldn't make it to Paris as planned. Ireland would have to be enough. She began watching for land, any land, as dawn broke over the Atlantic. When the Irish coast appeared through breaking clouds, she followed it north until she spotted a pasture that looked reasonably flat. She brought the Vega down in a steep approach, touching down in grass still wet with morning dew. The plane rolled to a stop near a stone fence. She shut down the engine, sat in sudden silence broken only by the ticking of hot metal cooling, and realized she had done it. 14 hours and 56 minutes after leaving Newfoundland, she had crossed the Atlantic alone. The farmhand who approached the plane asked if she had come far. "From America," she replied. He nodded politely, as if women routinely dropped out of the sky into Irish pastures. It wasn't until reporters arrived hours later that he understood who had landed in his field. The world's reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. President Herbert Hoover sent a telegram of congratulations. The National Geographic Society awarded her its gold medal. Congress voted to give her the Distinguished Flying Cross, the first woman ever to receive it. Ticker-tape parades greeted her in New York and other cities. But for Earhart, the flight's significance went deeper than accolades. She had proven that skill and courage weren't determined by gender. She had earned her place among the world's elite aviators, not as a woman pilot, but as a pilot, full stop. Yet even this achievement came with qualifications. The press still framed her success in terms of gender, writing headlines about the lady aviator, rather than simply calling her an aviator. Product endorsements continued, trading on her fame rather than her expertise. She used the attention to advocate for women's aviation, encouraging flight schools to accept female students and airlines to hire female pilots. But advocacy wasn't enough. She needed to push further, to accomplish something so undeniable that gender would become irrelevant in the telling. By 1936, Earhart had set her sights on a new goal: circumnavigating the globe at the equator, the longest route possible. No pilot, male or female, had completed such a journey. The flight would cover approximately 29,000 miles, crossing oceans, jungles, and deserts with limited navigation technology and even more limited infrastructure. She spent months studying maps, consulting meteorologists, and meeting with engineers to design modifications for her plane. The route would take her eastward from California, across South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific before returning home. The idea wasn't entirely original. Wiley Post had circled the globe in 1933, but his route passed through the northern latitudes where distances between land masses were shorter and weather more predictable. Flying at the equator meant longer ocean crossings, more extreme weather, and fewer emergency landing sites. It was the difference between taking the scenic route and taking the most dangerous route imaginable. For Earhart, that made it worth attempting. She approached the planning with the methodical precision of an engineer. She obtained navigation charts from the U.S. Navy and detailed weather data from meteorological services. She calculated fuel consumption rates at different altitudes and airspeeds, factoring in expected headwinds and variations in fuel quality available at remote airfields. Every variable was documented in notebooks that filled steadily as the months passed. The margin for error was thin. A miscalculation of just 5% in fuel consumption could mean the difference between reaching a destination and ditching in the ocean. Financing the expedition required creative fundraising. Purdue University, where Earhart served as a career counselor and visiting faculty member, contributed $50,000 toward purchasing an aircraft. She secured additional funding through sponsors, including the United States Department of Commerce and various private donors. In exchange, she agreed to gather scientific data during the flight air samples, weather observations, and notes on atmospheric conditions that might benefit future long-distance aviation. The expedition would serve both personal ambition and public benefit. Selecting the route demanded difficult compromises. The ideal path would follow established air routes with reliable fuel supplies and maintenance facilities, but those routes often deviated from the equatorial line that defined her goal. She chose to prioritize the equatorial route even when it meant landing at primitive airstrips or negotiating fuel deliveries to remote locations where aviation infrastructure barely existed. Each stop was researched exhaustively: runway length, surface condition, available fuel grades, local weather patterns, and political stability. Communication protocols posed another challenge. In 1936, long-distance radio communication was unreliable at best. She would be flying over regions with no radio infrastructure, where a mechanical failure or navigational error would leave her completely isolated. She arranged for the US Navy to position ships along her Pacific route to serve as radio relay stations and potential rescue platforms. The Coast Guard agreed to station vessels near her most vulnerable positions, but she knew that in an emergency, help might arrive too late. Her husband, George Putnam, managed much of the expedition's logistics and publicity. Their relationship was unconventional. She had married him in 1931, with a letter outlining her terms, including the right to pursue her career and the understanding that she might not be faithful. Putnam, a publisher and promoter, recognized Earhart's commercial value but also genuinely supported her ambitions. He negotiated with sponsors, arranged press coverage, and handled the 1,000 logistical details that made the flight possible. As planning progressed through late 1936, Earhart faced criticism from fellow aviators who questioned whether the flight served any purpose beyond publicity. What would circling the globe at the equator prove that hadn't already been demonstrated? She didn't offer elaborate justifications. "I want to do it because I want to do it," she told reporters, an echo of George Mallory's famous explanation for climbing Everest. The doing itself was the point. The challenge itself was the justification. By December 1936, the route was finalized, the aircraft was being modified, and departure was set for early 1937. Weather patterns dictated that she would need to depart California no later than March to avoid monsoon seasons in Asia and hurricane seasons in the Pacific. The window for the attempt was narrow. Everything needed to align perfectly: aircraft, crew, weather, logistics, and funding. But in aviation, as Earhart well knew, perfect alignments were rare. The best you could hope for was good enough, and the courage to proceed anyway. Earhart selected a Lockheed Electra 10E, a twin-engine monoplane known for its range and reliability. The aircraft was customized extensively for the journey. Extra fuel tanks were installed to extend its range to over 4,000 miles, unnecessary weight was stripped away, and the fuselage was reinforced to handle the stress of long-distance flight. The plane's silver body gleamed under the California sun as final preparations were made. The Electra was state-of-the-art for its time, but it was still a machine built in an era when aviation was barely 3 decades old, and long-distance flight remained as much art as science. The Lockheed Electra 10E was manufactured in 1936 and represented the cutting edge of commercial aviation design. Its twin Pratt and Whitney Wasp engines produced 600 horsepower each, giving it a cruising speed of approximately 190 miles per hour and a maximum speed near 220 miles per hour. The all-metal construction was more durable than wood and fabric designs, and the retractable landing gear reduced drag, improving fuel efficiency. For passengers, it offered comfort unimaginable in earlier aircraft. For Earhart, it offered something more important: endurance. The standard Electra 10E had a range of roughly 800 miles, adequate for commercial routes but insufficient for ocean crossings. Lockheed engineers installed additional fuel tanks throughout the aircraft, filling spaces in the fuselage and wings until the plane could carry 1,151 gallons of aviation fuel. This modification increased the range to over 4,000 miles under ideal conditions, though actual range would depend on altitude, airspeed, weather, and engine performance. With full fuel tanks, the aircraft weighed 13,500 pounds, 1,500 pounds above its designed maximum takeoff weight. This overloading would make takeoffs from short runways dangerous and would stress the airframe throughout the journey. Weight reduction became an obsession. Every item that didn't contribute directly to flight or navigation was removed. Passenger seats were stripped out. Soundproofing was eliminated. Even the parachutes were left behind over the Pacific Ocean. They would be useless anyway. The modifications left the interior bare and utilitarian. A flying fuel tank with just enough room for 2 crew members and their essential equipment. The aircraft's center of gravity shifted with the fuel load, requiring careful monitoring. A full load made the plane nose heavy as fuel burned off. Weight distribution changed, affecting handling characteristics. The instrument panel was customized with additional navigation equipment. A Bendix radio direction finder was installed, allowing the crew to track radio beacons and determine bearing to known stations. However, the system required a trailing wire antenna that had to be deployed in flight, a 250-foot wire that hung below the aircraft and could be reeled in for landing. The antenna was cumbersome and fragile, prone to breaking in turbulent conditions. A Western electric radio transmitter and receiver provided voice communication, though its range was limited and reliability questionable over long distances. Earhart Test flew the modified Electra extensively in early 1937, familiarizing herself with its handling characteristics under various load conditions. The additional fuel weight made the plane sluggish and unresponsive compared to standard configurations. Takeoff roll was significantly longer, and the aircraft required more altitude to maneuver safely. She practiced emergency procedures, engine failures, radio malfunctions, forced landings, trying to anticipate problems that might arise over remote oceans or jungles. One modification would prove controversial. The Electra was originally equipped with a 500 kHz radio system that would have allowed communication with ships at sea over distances of several hundred miles, but the system was complex and heavy, requiring the trailing wire antenna. After the Hawaii ground loop accident, which we'll discuss shortly, Earhart decided to remove the 500 kHz equipment to save weight and simplify operations. This decision eliminated one of her most reliable long-range communication options, leaving her dependent on less powerful radio systems that would prove inadequate during the flight's final leg. The Electra's silver paint was practical rather than aesthetic. The reflective surface reduced heat absorption from the sun, keeping the cockpit cooler during long flights over tropical regions. The plane carried minimal markings, just the registration number NR16020 on the fuselage and tail. No national flags, no sponsor logos, nothing that might cause diplomatic complications in foreign countries with uncertain political climates. By March 1937, the aircraft was as ready as engineering and budget allowed. It represented the best aviation technology available. modified to the edge of safety margins, flown by one of the world's most experienced pilots. But aircraft are only as reliable as their weakest component, and in 1937, every component was a potential point of failure. Engine reliability was measured in hundreds of hours, not thousands. Radio systems were temperamental. Navigation equipment was primitive by modern standards. Flying the Electra around the world would be less like driving a reliable car across the country, and more like sailing a small boat across an ocean, dependent on skill, preparation, and luck in measures that were impossible to predict. The aircraft was ready. The pilot was ready. But readiness, as Earhart would soon discover, was no guarantee against disaster. Fred Noonan was one of the most experienced navigators in the world when Earhart chose him for the journey. He had pioneered trans-Pacific routes for Pan American Airways, navigating by celestial observation with near-perfect accuracy. But Noonan carried a shadow. He had been let go from Pan Am amid rumours of alcohol dependency. Some questioned whether he was fit for such a demanding flight. Earhart, however, trusted his skills. She believed that on a journey where even a 1-degree navigational error could mean missing a tiny island by hundreds of miles, Noonan's expertise was indispensable. It was a decision that would be scrutinised for decades. Frederick Joseph Noonan was born in 1,893 inches, London, England. Immigrating to the United States with his family as a child, he went to sea as a teenager, working aboard merchant vessels where he learned the fundamentals of maritime navigation using sextants to measure celestial angles, calculating position from sun and star sites, and plotting courses across featureless oceans. These skills, refined over years at sea, would later transfer seamlessly to aviation. When Pan American Airways began establishing trans-Pacific routes in the early 1932s, Noonan was recruited as one of their chief navigators. His work with Pan Am was nothing short of revolutionary. He navigated survey flights across the Pacific, charting routes that commercial aircraft would follow for decades. He helped establish the navigation protocols for flights between California and Hawaii, Hawaii and Guam, Guam and the Philippines, and ultimately to China. These routes crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, with no landmarks, no radio beacons, and no margin for error. A navigation mistake could leave an aircraft circling over empty water until fuel exhaustion forced a ditching. Noonan's celestial navigation was so accurate that he rarely missed his intended landfall by more than a few miles. But by 1937, his career was in decline. Pan American had terminated his employment in late 1936, under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear. The official reason was listed as reorganization, but rumours circulated that Noonan had been dismissed due to alcohol-related issues. Some reports suggested he had shown up intoxicated for flights, or had been found drinking while on duty. Others claimed he had simply developed a reputation for heavy drinking during layovers, which Pan Am's management found incompatible with the company's professional image. Noonan had recently married his second wife, Mary Beatrice Martinelli, in March 1937. Friends suggested the marriage was an attempt to stabilise his personal life and address the drinking that had damaged his professional reputation. Whether he had genuinely conquered his alcohol dependency or was simply between episodes remains unknown. What is certain is that by early 1937, one of the world's most skilled navigators was unemployed and looking for work that would rehabilitate his reputation. Earhart approached him in February 1937. She needed a navigator capable of handling the expedition's most challenging legs, particularly the Pacific crossings where accurate celestial navigation would be essential. Noonan's Pan Am experience made him uniquely qualified. He had navigated the exact routes she would be flying, under similar conditions, using the same techniques she would require. His personal struggles were known to her, but she weighed them against his professional competence and made a calculated decision to hire him. The choice was not without controversy. Other aviators questioned whether Noonan's past made him a liability. What if his problems resurfaced during a critical phase of flight? Celestial navigation required steady hands and clear thinking qualities potentially compromised by alcohol. But Earhart defended her decision, pointing to Noonan's unmatched expertise and expressing confidence that his recent marriage and the significance of the expedition would keep him focused and sober. Noonan brought more than navigation skills to the expedition. He contributed to route planning, advised on communication protocols, and helped coordinate logistics with Pan Am stations across the Pacific. His contacts at Pan Am proved valuable in arranging fuel deliveries and maintenance support at remote locations. He was also a licensed pilot, capable of flying the Electra if Earhart needed rest during long overwater legs, though she rarely relinquished the controls. Their working relationship appears to have been professional and functional. Earhart was focused and disciplined. Noonan was experienced and methodical. Neither was particularly warm or emotionally expressive, and their interactions were described by observers as businesslike. There's no evidence of personal friction, but also no suggestion of deep friendship. They were professionals collaborating on a dangerous enterprise, each bringing essential skills to the endeavour. As the March 1937 departure approached, Noonan prepared his navigation charts, calculating sun lines, star positions, and compass headings for each leg of the journey. His charts showed meticulous attention to detail: wind correction angles, magnetic variation, fuel consumption rates, and alternate landing sites. He assembled his navigation tools: sextants, chronometers, plotting equipment, and navigation tables. Everything was organised and rehearsed. If skill and preparation could ensure success, they were ready. But navigation is only as good as the information it's based on. Weather forecasts in 1937 were approximate at best. Wind speeds and directions could vary significantly from predictions. Cloud cover could make celestial navigation impossible. And on the flight's final leg to Howland Island, these variables would combine in ways that skill and preparation couldn't overcome. The question that would haunt investigators for decades was whether Noonan's past played any role in what happened over the Pacific. Was he impaired during the final navigation, or was he simply facing an impossible task, finding a tiny island in an enormous ocean with inadequate tools and insufficient information? The ocean would keep that answer as completely as it kept everything else. Earhart's first attempt to circle the globe began on March 17, 1937, departing from Oakland, California. The plan was to fly westward, but the journey nearly ended in tragedy before it truly began. On March 20th, during takeoff from Luke Field in Hawaii, the Electra ground looped on the runway, suffering significant damage to the landing gear and lower fuselage. Witnesses described the plane swinging violently before collapsing onto one wing. The cause was never definitively determined. Some blamed a blown tire, others suggested pilot error. The damaged aircraft was shipped back to California for repairs, and the attempt was postponed. The flight from Oakland to Honolulu had gone smoothly. Earhart, Noonan, and a third crew member, technical advisor Harry Manning, completed the 2,400-mile crossing in just over 15 hours. The Electra performed flawlessly, and the crew arrived in Hawaii confident and optimistic. After 2 days of rest and maintenance checks, they prepared for the next leg, a 1,900-mile flight to Howland Island, then onward to New Guinea and across the Pacific. Luke Field, a US Army airfield on Ford Island in Pearl Harbor, had a 3,000-foot runway adequate under normal conditions, but marginal for an aircraft loaded with maximum fuel. The Electra's gross weight that morning exceeded 15,000 pounds, well above its designed limits. Every gallon of fuel was necessary for the long overwater leg ahead, but the extra weight made the plane sluggish and difficult to control during the critical acceleration phase of takeoff. The morning of March 20th was clear with light winds. Earhart began her takeoff roll at approximately 5:40 a.m., accelerating down the runway as the heavily loaded Electra struggled to gain speed. Witnesses reported that the takeoff appeared normal. Initially, the tail came up, the plane accelerated smoothly, and liftoff seemed imminent. Then, about halfway down the runway, something went wrong. The aircraft began to swerve. Earhart attempted to correct with rudder and throttle adjustments, but the swerve worsened. The right wing dipped toward the pavement. The plane pivoted sharply to the right in a violent ground loop, spinning nearly 180 degrees. The right landing gear collapsed under the stress, followed by the left. The Electra slid across the runway in a shower of sparks from scraping metal, the propellers striking the concrete and bending backward. Fuel sprayed from ruptured lines. The aircraft came to rest on its belly, the wings intact, but the undercarriage destroyed. Earhart and her crew evacuated immediately, shaken but uninjured. Emergency crews arrived within minutes, spraying foam to prevent ignition of spilled fuel. The damage was extensive, the landing gear was completely destroyed, the propellers were ruined, the engine mounts were stressed, and the lower fuselage had multiple punctures and tears. The aircraft would require major repairs before it could fly again. The investigation that followed produced no definitive conclusion. Some witnesses claimed they saw a tire blow during the takeoff roll, which could have caused the uncontrollable swerve. Others suggested Earhart had overcorrected a minor drift, inducing the ground loop through excessive rudder input. A few speculated that the overloaded condition had simply made the aircraft uncontrollable at low speed. Earhart herself offered little explanation, stating only that she had lost directional control and couldn't prevent the accident. The financial and logistical consequences were severe. The Electra had to be partially disassembled and shipped back to Lockheed's factory in California, aboard the USS Lurleen. Repairs would cost approximately $25,000 money that required additional fundraising and sponsorship negotiations. More critically, the delay meant missing the optimal weather window for the westward route. Monsoon seasons were approaching in Asia, and typhoon season in the Pacific would make flying increasingly dangerous. As the damaged Electra was crated for shipment, Earhart faced a choice: abandon the attempt entirely, or restructure the flight with a new route and new timeline. The Hawaii ground loop had been a humiliating setback, broadcast in newspapers worldwide. Critics suggested she was reckless, that the flight was too dangerous, that she was tempting fate, but Earhart had built her entire career on refusing to accept limits. The accident would not be the end. Instead, it would mark the beginning of a new plan, one that would reverse the route, change the crew, and set in motion the events that would lead to aviation's greatest mystery. But first, the plane had to be rebuilt. After the Hawaii incident, Earhart made a critical decision. She would reverse the route and fly eastward instead. The change meant departing from Miami and crossing the Atlantic first, then Africa and Asia before attempting the most dangerous leg, the vast emptiness of the Pacific. On June 1st, 1937, the repaired Electra lifted off from Miami International Airport with Earhart and Noonan aboard. Crowds watched as the silver plane climbed into the morning sky and turned toward the horizon. It would be the beginning of a month-long journey across some of the most remote regions on Earth. The decision to reverse the route was both practical and strategic. Flying eastward meant confronting the prevailing winds differently. Generally more favourable tailwinds across the Atlantic and Africa, but potentially stronger headwinds across the Pacific. It also meant attempting the most challenging navigation last, after both crew and aircraft had been tested over thousands of miles. Whether this made the flight safer or simply postponed the greatest danger remained to be seen. The crew change was equally significant. Harry Manning, who had accompanied Earhart on the first attempt, was unavailable for the revised schedule. His obligations as a ship's captain required him to return to his regular employment. This left just Earhart and Noonan, pilot and navigator, with no backup for either position. If one became incapacitated, the other would face an impossible situation. But the reduced crew meant less weight and more room for fuel, both critical for the long Pacific crossing. The Electra's repairs had taken nearly 2 months. Lockheed engineers had not only fixed the damage from the ground loop, but had implemented additional modifications based on lessons learned. The landing gear was reinforced. Engine mountings were strengthened. The fuel system was inspected and upgraded. By late May, the aircraft was ready for another attempt. Though the repair costs had depleted Earhart's budget to the point where she could afford no further setbacks. Departure day arrived under partly cloudy skies. The Miami runway was longer than Luke Field, and the aircraft was lighter due to the shorter first leg to Puerto Rico. Only 1,000 miles compared to the 1,900 miles to Howland that had been planned from Hawaii. The reduced fuel load made the takeoff safer, the one concession to caution after the Hawaii accident. At 5:56 a.m. on June 1st, the Electra accelerated down the runway and lifted off smoothly, banking southeast over Biscayne Bay toward the Atlantic. The flight to San Juan, Puerto Rico, took just over 7 hours. Earhart and Noonan landed in mid-afternoon, refueled, and continued immediately to Carapito, Venezuela, arriving as darkness fell. The pace would remain aggressive throughout the journey, minimize ground time, maximize progress, stay ahead of changing weather patterns. Each day on the ground meant consuming resources without advancing toward the goal. From Venezuela, they island hopped along the South American coast, Paramaribo in Dutch Guiana, Fortaleza in Brazil, making steady progress toward the Atlantic crossing. At each stop, mechanics inspected the engines, checked oil levels, and examined the landing gear for stress fractures. Fuel was filtered to remove water and sediment that could damage engine components. Radio equipment was tested, though reliable communication was often impossible in these remote locations. The routine became familiar. Dawn takeoffs, long hours in the cockpit with only engine noise and each other for company, afternoon landings at crude airstrips, where local authorities were often surprised to see an aircraft at all. Earhart handled most of the flying while Noonan focused on navigation, calculating their position from sun sights and radio bearings, plotting courses on charts spread across his lap. They communicated through hand signals and shouted conversations over the engine roar. The cockpit was too loud for normal speech. Sleep came in brief intervals at uncomfortable hotels or guest houses near the airfields. The equatorial heat was oppressive, the humidity draining. Mosquitoes were relentless in coastal regions. Food was often unfamiliar and occasionally suspect, leading to digestive issues that added physical discomfort to the mental stress of long-distance flight. But they pressed on, driven by schedule, budget constraints, and the knowledge that turning back now would mean total failure. By mid-June, they had crossed the Atlantic to Africa and were making their way eastward through the continent. The Electra's engines had accumulated hundreds of hours of operation without major issues. The fuel system worked flawlessly. The aircraft was proving its worth as one of the most reliable machines of its era. Confidence grew with each successful leg, but confidence, as any pilot knows, is a dangerous thing. It dulls vigilance, encourages complacency, and creates the belief that the next leg will be like all the previous ones. The journey had been difficult but manageable. The Pacific crossing would be neither, and waiting in the vastness of that ocean was a tiny island they would never see. The first leg took them south along the coast of Venezuela and across the Amazon basin into Brazil. They refueled in Fortaleza, a coastal city where the ocean wind carried the smell of salt and tropical vegetation. From there, they made the 1,900-mile crossing to Dakar in Senegal, flying over open water for hours with nothing but the drone of twin engines and the vast blue below. The Atlantic crossing was uneventful, a successful test of both plane and crew. When they touched down in Africa, Earhart radioed that the Electra was performing beautifully. Everything, it seemed, was going according to plan. The South American segment of the journey served as a shakedown for the crew and equipment. Each leg tested different aspects of their operation. Short hops that emphasized takeoff and landing procedures, longer flights that validated fuel consumption calculations, overwater navigation that would preview the Pacific challenges ahead. The variety was deliberate. By the time they reached Africa, Earhart and Noonan needed to function as a seamless unit, anticipating each other's needs and responding to problems without lengthy discussion. Fortaleza, Brazil, represented a critical waypoint. The city's airport was one of the few in South America with adequate facilities for international flights. Pan American Airways maintained a station there, and the mechanics were experienced with long-range aircraft. The Electra received a thorough inspection, engine compression tests, spark plug examinations, control surface checks, and a detailed review of all systems. Minor issues were corrected. An oil leak was traced to a loose fitting and fixed. A bulky fuel transfer pump was disassembled and cleaned, and the radio antenna reel mechanism was lubricated after showing signs of resistance. The departure from Fortaleza for Dakar marked the journey's first major ocean crossing. The 1,900 miles would take approximately 13 hours shorter than the Pacific legs ahead, but long enough to test endurance and validate navigation procedures. Noonan plotted their course carefully, accounting for the South Equatorial Current's effect on wind patterns and calculating fuel reserves for various contingencies. They departed in early morning darkness, the runway lights disappearing behind them as they climbed eastward over the Atlantic. The crossing was everything an overwater flight should be and rarely is: smooth air, clear skies, and steady winds within a few degrees of forecast. Noonan took sun sights at regular intervals, plotting their position with precision that showed them tracking within 5 miles of their planned course. The Electra's engines purred with mechanical contentment, oil temperatures and pressures remaining stable throughout. By mid-morning, Earhart had settled into the rhythm of long-distance flight. Scan instruments, check fuel gauges, adjust throttle and mixture for optimal efficiency. Scan instruments again. Hours passed in a meditative routine broken only by Noonan's periodic navigation updates. The African coast appeared exactly where and when Noonan had predicted, a dark line on the eastern horizon that resolved into beaches and palm trees as they descended toward Dakar. The landing was smooth, a textbook arrival after 13 hours and 10 minutes in the air. Ground crew rushed to greet them, and French colonial officials welcomed them with formal courtesy. The Atlantic had been conquered without drama or difficulty, a confidence-building success that validated their planning and preparation. Earhart's radio message to her husband, George Putnam, back in the United States reflected optimism. Plane performing magnificently. No problems. Crew in good spirits. The message would be published in newspapers worldwide, feeding public interest in the journey. But the words also revealed something about Earhart's mindset. She was flying with increasing confidence, perhaps beginning to believe that the flight's greatest challenges lay behind them. They remained in Dakar for 2 days, waiting for weather clearance for the next leg and allowing mechanics to perform routine maintenance. The Electra's oil was changed, filters were cleaned, and the engines were inspected for any signs of excessive wear. Everything checked normal. The aircraft had now accumulated over 25,000 total flight hours. Since manufacture, an impressive figure for the era, and the specific engines on Earhart's plane had several hundred hours of operation. They were well within their reliability envelope. During the layover, Earhart gave interviews to local press and met with French aviation officials who expressed admiration for her accomplishment. Noonan spent hours in the meteorology office, studying weather charts and consulting with forecasters about conditions across Africa. A high-pressure system was dominating the region, promising generally favourable weather for their eastward progress. The timing was fortunate. Monsoons would begin in Asia within weeks, and they needed to cross that continent before the worst weather arrived. The success of the Atlantic crossing provided psychological momentum. The ocean had tested them, and they had passed. The flight path ahead offered more frequent landing sites and better infrastructure. The Pacific crossing was still weeks away, time enough to address any problems that emerged. For the first time since leaving Miami, Earhart allowed herself to believe that the circumnavigation was not only possible, but probable. But oceans are deceptive. The Atlantic's kindness did not predict the Pacific's character, and the ease of a flight under favourable conditions offers no preparation for what happens when conditions turn hostile and margins disappear. The next ocean would offer no second chances. From Senegal, they flew east across Africa, following a route that took them over desert, savanna, and jungle. They stopped in Chad, Sudan, and Eritrea before crossing into Asia. In Karachi, India, they dealt with monsoon weather that delayed their departure. They pressed on through Calcutta, Rangoon, Bangkok, and Singapore, navigating by landmarks, radio beacons, and celestial observations. Each stop brought new challenges: language barriers, fuel quality concerns, mechanical inspections, but the Electra continued to perform, and the crew's confidence grew with every successful landing. The African continent presented obstacles that had nothing to do with flying. The colonial infrastructure of 1,937 was minimal in many regions. Airfields were often nothing more than cleared strips of earth, sometimes marked with whitewashed stones, sometimes not marked at all. Fuel supplies were unreliable. Aviation gasoline might be contaminated with water, or stored in rusting drums that introduced sediment into the aircraft's tanks. Earhart and Noonan learned to carefully filter every gallon, sometimes taking hours to fuel the Electra properly. Fort Lamy in Chad, now known as N'Djamena, was particularly challenging. The airfield was a dirt strip carved from scrubland, the surface rutted and uneven. The temperature exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, and there was no shade. The Electra's metal surfaces became too hot to touch. Engine cooling was problematic. The air was so hot that it provided little temperature differential for the cooling system. They departed before dawn to take advantage of cooler temperatures, the Electra's engines straining in the thin, hot air. Khartoum in Sudan offered better facilities. with a proper hangar and mechanics familiar with maintaining aircraft. The Electra received its most thorough inspection since leaving South America. One engine's spark plugs showed signs of fouling and were replaced. A hydraulic line was weeping fluid and was tightened. These were minor issues, routine maintenance rather than serious problems, but they consumed time and resources. Each delay increased the risk of encountering monsoon weather in Asia. The Red Sea crossing to Massawa and Eritrea took them over water again, though only 200 miles. The sea below was an impossible blue, the desert coast stark and lifeless. They followed the coastline south, then cut inland toward the mountains of Ethiopia, before descending to Massawa's coastal airfield. From there, they continued to Karachi, crossing the Arabian Sea in a 13-hour flight that left both pilot and navigator exhausted. Karachi marked their entry into Asia and their first encounter with monsoon weather. Heavy rains had flooded the airfield's drainage systems, leaving standing water on portions of the runway. Thunderstorms rolled through with regularity, bringing torrential downpours and strong winds. They were grounded for 3 days, waiting for a weather window that would allow them to continue safely. The delay was frustrating but unavoidable. Flying into monsoon systems was suicidal, and even Earhart's determination had limits. When they finally departed Karachi, the monsoon was still active but temporarily weakened. They flew through broken clouds and intermittent rain to Calcutta, where they encountered more delays due to weather. The pattern continued through Rangoon and Bangkok. Fly in marginal conditions, land, wait for weather to improve, depart again. Progress slowed to a crawl. The schedule they had optimistically planned in California was collapsing under the weight of meteorological reality. Singapore provided a welcome respite. The British colonial administration maintained excellent facilities, and the mechanics at the RAF station were highly competent. The Electra received a comprehensive inspection that found everything in good order except for normal wear items. The engines had accumulated significant hours, but showed no signs of distress. Oil consumption was within normal parameters. The airframe was sound. Earhart sent another optimistic message to Putnam. All going well despite weather delays. From Singapore, they island hopped through the Dutch East Indies, Bandung, Surabaya, Kupang, gradually working their way toward Australia and New Guinea. The tropical heat was oppressive. The humidity, near 100% at every stop. Both Earhart and Noonan showed signs of fatigue. The cumulative effect of inadequate sleep, marginal food, and the constant physical and mental demands of long-distance flight. They had been travelling for nearly a month, covering over 20,000 miles, and the strain was evident in their terse radio communications and shortened interviews with local press. Darwin, Australia, marked their last stop before New Guinea. The Australian authorities were welcoming and efficient, and the facilities were the best they had encountered since leaving the United States. Earhart took the opportunity to rest for a full day, sleeping for nearly 12 hours and eating proper meals. The break helped, but it couldn't eliminate the accumulated fatigue of a month's continuous travel. The flight from Darwin to Lae, New Guinea, crossed the Arafura and Coral Seas, navigating between weather systems and avoiding the worst of the tropical turbulence. They arrived in Lae on June 29th, having covered 22,000 miles in 29 days. They had flown across continents and oceans, through storms and clear skies, over civilizations and wilderness. The journey had been difficult but successful. Only one major obstacle remained, but that obstacle would prove to be unlike anything they had faced before. On June 29th, 1937, Earhart and Noonan arrived in Lae, Papua New Guinea, one of the most remote outposts on their route. They had already covered 22,000 miles. Only 7,000 remained. But the next leg would be the most treacherous, yet a 2,556-mile flight across the Pacific Ocean to Howland Island, a tiny coral atoll barely visible from the air. Howland was only 1.6 miles long and half a mile wide, a speck in an ocean that covered millions of square miles. Missing it would mean running out of fuel over open water with no chance of rescue. Lae was barely more than a frontier outpost in 1937. The airfield was a grass strip carved from jungle near the coast, maintained primarily for gold mining operations in the interior highlands. Guinea Airways operated regular flights, bringing supplies inland and carrying gold back to the coast. But international traffic was rare. The arrival of Earhart's Electra was the most significant aviation event in Lay's brief history. The local population, a mix of Australian colonial administrators, gold miners, and indigenous Papuans, turned out to watch the silver plane land. Earhart and Noonan emerged from the cockpit looking exhausted and weathered. A month of tropical heat, inadequate rest, and constant stress had taken its toll. Photographs from Lay show Earhart looking noticeably thinner than images from Miami, her face drawn with fatigue. Noonan appeared haggard, his characteristic smile replaced by a tired grimace. The Electra needed attention. The engines had accumulated hundreds of hours since the last major service, operating in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Extreme heat, high humidity, contaminated fuel, and constant heavy loading. Guinea Airways chief mechanic, a man named Sid Marshall, performed what maintenance he could with limited tools and parts. He changed the oil, cleaned the spark plugs, inspected the landing gear for stress cracks, and checked the control surfaces for proper rigging. Everything appeared satisfactory. But Marshall later admitted he couldn't perform the comprehensive inspection the aircraft really needed. Lay simply lacked the facilities and parts inventory for major work. The next leg's magnitude weighed heavily on both crew members. Howland Island lay 2,556 statute miles to the northeast, approximately 18 hours of flying time under ideal conditions. But conditions were unlikely to be ideal. Weather reports showed a convergent zone, with scattered clouds and variable winds. The winds could not be predicted with certainty, meaning fuel calculations required significant safety margins. And Howland Island presented a navigation challenge unlike anything they had faced. A tiny target in an enormous ocean, with no nearby landmarks and no radio beacon powerful enough to provide reliable guidance from long range. The US Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed near Howland to provide radio communication and navigation assistance. The plan called for the Itasca to transmit radio signals that Earhart could use with her direction finder to home in on the island. But this required both the ship's transmitter and Earhart's receiver to function properly, and it required Earhart to be on the correct frequency at the correct time. The coordination was complex, the equipment was temperamental, and there was no way to test the system before departure. Earhart and Noonan spent 2 days in Lay, waiting for favourable weather and preparing for the flight. They studied meteorological data, such as it was weather forecasting in the South Pacific, was primitive, based on limited observations from scattered islands and passing ships. They reviewed their route, calculating checkpoint times and fuel consumption rates. They sent telegrams to the Itasca, confirming radio frequencies and transmission schedules. They did everything preparation could accomplish. But preparation has limits. The Electra would be flying at maximum weight 1,100 gallons of fuel, 12 gallons of oil, plus the weight of 2 crew members and their equipment. The gross weight would exceed 15,000 pounds, the same overloaded condition that had contributed to the Hawaii ground loop. The runway at Lay was short and uneven, surrounded by obstacles. The takeoff would be dangerous, the aircraft barely able to climb with such a heavy load. On July 1st, they received weather reports suggesting a brief window of relatively favourable conditions. Scattered clouds, light to moderate winds, no major storms along their route. It was as good as conditions were likely to get. Earhart made the decision. They would depart the following morning, July 2nd, at 10 a.m. local time. That final night in Lay, Earhart wrote a letter to her husband. The contents have never been fully disclosed, but witnesses reported she appeared subdued, perhaps contemplative about the challenge ahead. Noonan spent the evening reviewing his charts one final time, checking calculations, plotting alternate courses if winds proved different than forecast. Neither crew member seemed to expect failure, but both understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. The morning of July 2nd arrived with partly cloudy skies and light winds. Ground crew topped off the Electra's fuel tanks, filling every gallon of capacity. The engines were warmed up, instruments checked, control surfaces tested. Everything appeared normal. At approximately 10 a.m., Earhart released the brakes and began her takeoff roll. The heavily loaded Electra accelerated slowly down Lay's grass runway, the propellers clawing for purchase in the humid air. Witnesses held their breath as the plane consumed nearly the entire 3,000-foot strip before finally lifting off, barely clearing the trees at the runway's end. The silver aircraft turned northeast, climbing gradually over the Solomon Sea, and disappeared into scattered clouds. It was the last time anyone on the ground would see Amelia Earhart or Fred Noonan alive. The Pacific lay ahead, vast and indifferent. And somewhere in that vastness, a tiny island waited a target they would search for but never find. Earhart and Noonan made their final preparations. The Electra was loaded with 1,100 gallons of fuel, filling every available tank and giving them approximately 20 to 21 hours of flight time. They studied weather reports and charts, noting that they would be flying into headwinds that could slow their progress. Communication would be difficult. Howland Island had minimal radio equipment, and the Electra's radio direction finding system had been problematic throughout the journey. Still, the US Coast Guard cutter Itasca was stationed near Howland to provide radio guidance and weather updates. Everything that could be done had been done. The fuel load represented a calculated gamble. At maximum consumption, the Electra's engines burned approximately 55 gallons per hour. With 1,100 gallons aboard, that gave them 20 hours of flight time adequate for the 18-hour journey to Howland with a 2-hour reserve. But the calculation assumed optimal conditions. No significant headwinds, no deviations from the planned route, no time spent searching for the island. Any of those factors could reduce the safety margin to nothing. Noonan's navigation plan was methodical. He would use celestial navigation for the first portion of the flight, taking sun sights to establish their position and verify they were tracking toward Howland. As they approached the island, he would rely increasingly on radio direction finding, using signals from the Itasca to home in on their destination. The plan was sound, but it required clear skies for celestial observation and reliable radio communication for direction finding. If either failed, they would be navigating by dead reckoning alone, estimating position based on airspeed, heading, and elapsed time, a method vulnerable to cumulative errors. The radio situation was particularly concerning. Throughout the journey, the Electra's radio equipment had been temperamental. Sometimes transmissions were clear and strong, other times they were weak or non-existent. The direction-finding system required the trailing wire antenna that Earhart had removed after the Hawaii accident, limiting its effectiveness. And the communication plan with the Itasca was complex. Different frequencies for different times, specific schedules for transmissions and receptions. Any miscommunication or equipment failure could leave them unable to locate the island. Weather forecasts offered mixed news. No major storms were predicted along their route, but scattered clouds and variable winds were expected. Cloud cover would interfere with celestial navigation. Headwinds would increase fuel consumption. Neither factor was catastrophic individually, but together they narrowed already thin margins. Earhart and Noonan discussed these challenges, weighing risks against the alternative of abandoning the attempt. They had come 22,000 miles. Only 7,000 remained. The Pacific crossing was the reason for reversing their route, for accepting delays and hardships across 3 continents. Turning back now was unthinkable. On the evening of July 1st, they made their final decision. They would depart at 10 a.m. the following morning, giving them daylight for takeoff and arrival at Howland in the early morning hours of July 3rd. The timing would allow Noonan to take celestial observations during the flight and provide visual approach to Howland at dawn. It was the best plan they could devise with the information and resources available. But the Pacific Ocean cares nothing for plans. At 10 a.m. local time, on July 2nd, 1937, the Electra began its takeoff roll down Lay's rough airstrip. Witnesses watched as the heavily loaded plane used nearly the entire runway, barely lifting off before disappearing over the trees. The extra fuel weight made the takeoff marginal. Some observers later said they weren't sure the plane would make it, but Earhart coaxed the Electra into the air, and it turned northeast toward the open Pacific. It was the last time anyone on the ground saw Amelia Earhart or Fred Noonan alive. The grass runway at Lay ran roughly east-west, approximately 3,000 feet long and 150 feet wide. The surface was uneven, with ruts from previous landings and soft spots where drainage was poor. At the eastern end, The runway terminated at a line of trees approximately 50 feet tall. Beyond the trees lay the Solomon Sea, sparkling in the tropical Sunday. It was a challenging departure under any circumstances. With maximum fuel load, it became an exercise in precise airmanship. Earhart advanced the throttle slowly, feeling the Electra respond with agonizing sluggishness. The heavily loaded aircraft accelerated reluctantly, the wheels bouncing over uneven ground. She held the control yoke slightly forward, keeping the tail down to maintain maximum angle of attack on the wings. The airspeed indicator crept upward. 40 miles per hour. 50. 60. The trees at the runway's end grew larger, rushing toward them with alarming speed. At approximately 70 miles per hour, Earhart eased back on the yoke. The Electra lifted off, settled back, lifted again. She held it in ground effect, allowing the aircraft to accelerate in the cushion of air between wings and earth. The airspeed reached 80 miles per hour, then 85. The trees were directly ahead now, their tops level with the cockpit. She pulled back firmly, trading speed for altitude. The Electra climbed, barely, clearing the trees with perhaps 10 feet to spare. Guinea Airways personnel who witnessed the takeoff later described it as one of the most marginal departures they had ever seen. Eric Chater, the station manager, radioed Earhart shortly after takeoff to confirm she was airborne safely. Her response was brief. All okay. The Electra climbed slowly over the ocean, turning northeast toward Howland Island, 2,556 miles away. At her cruising altitude of approximately 10,000 feet, the silver aircraft would have been visible from Leh for perhaps 20 minutes before distance and clouds obscured it completely. Chater was the last person to confirm communication with Earhart. His radio log shows her final message from the Leh area at 10:30 a.m. local time. Position 0 degrees 5, south 147 degrees 33 east, height 7,000 feet. Everything okay. The position was approximately 20 miles northeast of Leh, consistent with her planned route. The altitude indicated she was still climbing to cruise altitude. Nothing in the transmission suggested any problems. After that message, the Electra passed beyond range of Leh's radio station. For the next 18 hours, communication would depend entirely on the Itasca, positioned near Howland Island over 2,000 miles away. The ship's radio operators began their listening watch, scanning the agreed-upon frequencies, waiting for Earhart's voice to emerge from the static. The wait would be long, punctuated by brief transmissions that raised more questions than they answered. Somewhere over the Pacific, the silver Electra droned northeast through tropical skies, carrying 2 people toward a destination they would never reach. The Itasca began listening for radio transmissions from the Electra as it approached Howland Island. Earhart's voice came through intermittently on 3,105 kHz, her transmissions brief and broken by static. "Cloudy and overcast," she reported at one point. Hours passed. The transmissions grew stronger, indicating she was getting closer. But the Itasca's attempts to respond went unanswered. Earhart either wasn't receiving them or wasn't listening on the correct frequency. Tension mounted aboard the cutter as the crew realized that communication was failing at the worst possible moment. The Itasca's radio log, preserved in the National Archives, documents a frustrating pattern of one-way communication. Earhart transmitted periodically, but never acknowledged receiving any messages from the ship. The Itasca's radio operators sent continuous responses on multiple frequencies, trying to establish two-way contact, but their efforts met only silence. Either Earhart's receiver was malfunctioning, or she was listening on the wrong frequency, or she was transmitting during scheduled times without listening for responses. The first transmission the Itasca received came at 2:45 a.m. Howland time on July 2nd. Earhart's voice was weak and distorted, cloudy and overcast. The brevity was puzzling. No position report, no estimated time of arrival, just a weather observation. The Itasca responded immediately, sending weather information and requesting Earhart's position. No acknowledgement came. 30 minutes later, another brief transmission. Overcast. Again, the Itasca responded. Again, no acknowledgement. At 3:45 a.m., a stronger transmission. Itasca from Earhart. Overcast. We'll listen on hour on 3105. This was more promising. Earhart was telling them when she would be listening. The Itasca transmitted continuously on 3105 kHz, sending weather information, radio bearings, and encouragement. But at 4 a.m. and 4:30 a.m., when Earhart should have been listening, she transmitted instead, suggesting she wasn't following her own schedule or couldn't hear the Itasca's signals. The transmissions continued through the early morning hours, growing progressively stronger but remaining frustratingly brief. At 6:15 a.m, "Please take bearing on us and report in half hour. I will make noise in microphone. About 200 miles out." The Itasca's direction-finding equipment attempted to get a bearing, but Earhart's transmission was too short. The equipment needed at least 30 seconds to establish an accurate bearing, and she transmitted for only about 10 seconds. The pattern suggested Earhart was focused on flying and navigating, treating radio communication as a secondary priority. She transmitted when convenient, but didn't take time to listen for responses. This might have worked if they were simply providing progress reports, but it was catastrophic for direction finding. The Itasca needed long transmissions to establish bearings, and Earhart needed to listen to receive bearing information. Neither was happening. At 7:42 a.m, the transmissions took on a new urgency. Earhart's voice came through clearly, louder than previous messages. "We must be on you but cannot see you. Gas is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet. The message confirmed what the Itasca's crew had feared. Earhart was close to Howland Island, but couldn't locate it visually, and her fuel was becoming critically low. The ship immediately began generating smoke from its boilers, sending thick black clouds into the sky as a visual beacon. But there was no indication Earhart saw the smoke, and her next transmission would be her last. At 7:42 a.m. Howland Island time on July 2nd, Earhart's voice came through clearly. "We must be on you, but cannot see you. Gas is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio." 15 minutes later, another transmission. "We are running north and south." It was the last confirmed message ever received from Amelia Earhart. The Itasca sent up smoke signals, hoping she might see them. But there was no response. The radio fell silent. Somewhere out over the Pacific, the Electra had vanished. The final transmission at 8:43 a.m. was the strongest signal the Itasca had received all morning. Earhart's voice was clear and urgent. "We are on the line 157 to 337. We are running on line north and south." The signal strength indicated she was very close, possibly within 100 miles of Howland Island. The line 157 to 337 referred to a line of position Noonan had calculated from a celestial observation, a navigation technique that established their location along a specific line without determining their exact position on that line. The north-south running pattern suggested Earhart was flying perpendicular to the line of position, searching for Howland Island visually. This was a standard search technique. When uncertain of position, fly along or across a known line until spotting the destination. But it consumed precious fuel, and time was running out. The Itasca's crew listened intently, hoping for another transmission, but the radio remained silent. Minutes turned to hours. The Itasca continued transmitting on all agreed-upon frequencies, calling Earhart's name, broadcasting weather information, sending radio bearings based on their last transmission. They generated continuous smoke signals, visible for miles in the clear morning air. The ship's crew scanned the horizon with binoculars, watching for any sign of an aircraft. Nothing appeared. By 10 a.m., more than an hour after the last transmission, the Itasca's commanding officer, Commander Warner Thompson, faced a grim reality. Based on fuel calculations, the Electra should have exhausted its supply. If Earhart was still airborne, she was flying on fumes. More likely, she had already ditched in the ocean or crash-landed on an island. Thompson ordered the ship to begin searching the area north and south of Howland, the direction indicated by Earhart's final transmission. The radio log from that morning has been analysed exhaustively by researchers, looking for any clue about what went wrong. The transmissions show Earhart was confident of her position. "We must be on you." suggesting Noonan's navigation had brought them close to Howland Island. But something prevented them from seeing the island. Cloud cover might have obscured it. Navigation errors might have placed them slightly off course, or they might have been at the wrong altitude, too high or too low for visual acquisition of such a small target. The running north and south message has sparked particular debate. The line 157 to 337 passes through Howland Island, so flying along that line should eventually have revealed the island. But if they were even slightly off the line, or if they were flying parallel to it rather than along it, they could have passed within miles of Howland without seeing it. In an ocean with no landmarks and limited visibility, missing a tiny island by a few miles meant missing it completely. After 8:43 a.m., no credible radio transmission from Earhart was ever confirmed. Some amateur radio operators claimed to receive distress signals in the days following her disappearance, but none could be verified. The silence was absolute and final. Somewhere over the Pacific, the Electra had fallen from the sky. Within hours of the last transmission, the US Navy and Coast Guard launched what would become the most extensive air and sea search in history up to that time. The battleship USS Colorado, the aircraft carrier USS Lexington, and multiple other vessels swept the area around Howland Island, searching over 250,000 square miles of ocean. Planes flew grid patterns, scanning the water for any sign of wreckage or survivors. Days turned into weeks. Nothing was found, no oil slicks, no floating debris, no life rafts. It was as if the Electra had simply ceased to exist. The Itasca began searching immediately after Earhart's last transmission, steaming north of Howland Island along the line she had indicated. The ship's crew scanned the ocean surface, looking for any sign of an aircraft or survivors in the water. The sea was relatively calm, visibility was good, and conditions were favourable for spotting wreckage. But the ocean revealed nothing. By evening of July 2nd, Commander Thompson had expanded the search pattern, requesting additional vessels and aircraft from Navy commands across the Pacific. The response was unprecedented. President Franklin Roosevelt personally ordered the Navy to commit whatever resources necessary to find Earhart. The battleship Colorado departed Pearl Harbor immediately, carrying 3 float planes that could be launched to expand the search area. The aircraft carrier Lexington sortied from San Diego with 60 aircraft aboard. Destroyer escorts, minesweepers, and Coast Guard cutters converged on Howland Island from across the Pacific. Within a week, over 4,000 personnel and dozens of vessels were engaged in the search. The search grid was massive, based on calculations of where the Electra might have ditched given its last known position and remaining fuel. The area covered 250,000 square miles larger than the state of Texas, centered on Howland Island, but extending in all directions. Aircraft flew systematic patterns at low altitude, while ships steamed predetermined courses, all personnel scanning the water for any anomaly that might indicate wreckage or survivors. The Phoenix Islands, a group of coral atolls southeast of Howland, received particular attention. Gardner Island, Nikumaroro, and others were searched systematically, with aircraft flying low over each island and landing parties going ashore to look for signs of recent arrivals. Some islands showed evidence of recent campfires or disturbances, but nothing definitively linked to Earhart or Noonan. The vastness of the search area and the number of small islands made thorough investigation impossible within the limited time available. As days passed without discovery, hope faded. The Electra carried emergency supplies, including a life raft, water, and flares, but survival at sea in tropical waters was measured in days at most. By July 10th, 8 days after the disappearance, the probability of finding survivors had diminished to near zero. The search continued, but the focus shifted from rescue to recovery, finding wreckage that might explain what happened. On July 19th, after 17 days of intensive searching, the Navy officially called off the operation. The cost had exceeded $4 million, an enormous sum in 1937, and the commitment of resources was unsustainable. The official conclusion was that Earhart and Noonan had run out of fuel, ditched in the ocean, and perished. No evidence contradicted this conclusion, but no evidence supported it either. The lack of any physical trace left the door open to questions that would persist for decades. The failure to find any wreckage was both puzzling and precedent-setting. Modern searches for missing aircraft routinely locate debris fields, even in vast ocean areas, But in 1937, without satellite imagery, without sophisticated sonar, without the technology that would later make ocean searches effective, finding a small aircraft in millions of square miles of water was nearly impossible. The ocean had swallowed Amelia Earhart without leaving any trace, transforming a tragic navigation failure into an enduring mystery. On July 19, 1937, after 17 days of searching, the US government officially called off the search. The official conclusion was that Earhart and Noonan had run out of fuel, crashed into the ocean, and sank. On January 5, 1939, Amelia Earhart was declared legally dead, but the lack of physical evidence left the door open to speculation. How could a plane simply disappear without leaving any trace? The questions began immediately, and they've never stopped. The Navy's final report was brief and definitive. Based on fuel calculations, radio transmissions, and the extensive search that found nothing, investigators concluded that the Electra had exhausted its fuel supply somewhere near Howland Island and ditched in the ocean. The aircraft would have sunk rapidly, carrying both crew members to the bottom of the Pacific. The depth of the ocean in that region, exceeding 15,000 feet in places, would have made wreckage recovery impossible, even if the exact location had been known. The report acknowledged several contributing factors. The radio communication failure prevented the Itasca from providing effective navigation assistance. Weather conditions, particularly cloud cover, interfered with celestial navigation and visual acquisition of the island. Headwinds, stronger than forecasted, may have increased fuel consumption beyond planned reserves. Navigation errors, even minor ones, could have placed the Electra far enough off course that Howland Island remained beyond visual range. None of these factors was individually catastrophic, but together they created a situation where even experienced aviators could fail. Public reaction to the official conclusion was mixed. Many accepted it as the most logical explanation, a tragic accident resulting from the inherent dangers of long-distance aviation in an era of primitive technology, but others found it unsatisfying. Amelia Earhart was too famous, too skilled, too important to simply vanish without explanation. The human mind craves narrative closure, and the official report provided only an anticlimactic ending to a story that had captured global attention. The legal declaration of death in 1939 was necessary to settle Earhart's estate and resolve financial matters, but it did nothing to answer the deeper questions. Her husband George Putnam struggled with the ambiguity, simultaneously mourning her loss and hoping irrationally that she might somehow have survived. He would spend the rest of his life deflecting questions about the disappearance, unable to achieve the closure that a body or wreckage might have provided. The absence of physical evidence transformed a straightforward navigation failure into something larger, a mystery that would inspire books, documentaries, and expeditions for decades. Without wreckage to examine, without bodies to bury, without definitive proof of what happened in those final moments, every theory remained possible. The crash and sink explanation was logical and probable, but it was not proven. And in that gap between probable and proven, mystery flourished. Aviation accidents typically leave evidence wreckage patterns that indicate structural failure, burn marks that suggest fire, scattered debris that tells a story of final moments. The complete absence of such evidence at Howland Island was itself a clue, suggesting either that the search area was wrong or that something unusual had occurred. As years passed and technology improved, the mystery would only deepen, with each new search expedition finding nothing and each finding of nothing raising new questions. The official conclusion was neat, logical, and thoroughly unsatisfying. The simplest explanation is often the most likely. According to this theory, Earhart and Noonan missed Howland Island due to navigational error, radio failure, or a combination of both. When the fuel ran out, they ditched the plane in the ocean. The Electra, heavy with remaining fuel and equipment, would have sunk quickly. The Pacific is over 15,000 feet deep in places around Howland Island. Wreckage could easily have been lost forever. Modern ocean searches using sonar and submersibles have found no trace, but the area is vast and the ocean floor unforgiving. The crash and sink theory requires no conspiracy, no elaborate alternative narrative, no assumptions beyond what the evidence directly suggests. Earhart's final transmissions indicated she was near Howland Island, but couldn't locate it visually. She reported low fuel. She was flying a search pattern, burning precious fuel while looking for a target she couldn't find. The logical conclusion is that fuel exhaustion occurred before she found the island, forcing a ditching at sea. Ditching a twin-engine aircraft in ocean swells is extraordinarily difficult, even under ideal conditions. The Electra would have been travelling at approximately 90 miles per hour when it contacted the water. Even in relatively calm seas, the impact forces would have been severe, equivalent to hitting a concrete wall. The aircraft's aluminum structure would have crumpled on impact. Water would have rushed into the cabin through shattered windows and breached seams. The Electra carried no flotation devices beyond a small life raft. The aircraft itself would have sunk within minutes. If Earhart and Noonan survived the impact, they would have faced equally insurmountable challenges. The life raft, assuming they could deploy it, was designed for 2 people and carried minimal supplies, water for perhaps 3 days, some emergency rations, fishing gear, and flares. But they would have been adrift in an enormous ocean, hundreds of miles from any shipping lanes, with no way to communicate their position. The 1,937 search covered 250,000 square miles, but the Pacific spans 64 million square miles. 2 people in a small raft would be invisible from more than a few miles away. Survival time in tropical ocean waters is limited by dehydration, exposure, and exhaustion. Even with the emergency supplies, 3 to 5 days would have been optimistic. Without rescue in that window, survival becomes statistically impossible. The 1,937 search lasted 17 days, but it focused on areas near Howland Island. If the ditching occurred elsewhere, if navigation errors had placed them significantly off course, the search would have been looking in the wrong location entirely. Modern technology has enabled new searches of the ocean floor near Howland Island. In 2002, Nauticos Corporation conducted a deep ocean search using side-scan sonar, covering several hundred square miles of seafloor. They found nothing. In 2017, an expedition searched additional areas with high-resolution sonar and underwater vehicles. Again, nothing. These negative results don't disprove the crash and sink theory. They simply confirm how difficult it is to find small wreckage in vast ocean areas. The theory's greatest strength is its simplicity. It requires no speculation about what might have happened after running out of fuel. It accepts the evidence at face value. Earhart was near Howland, reported low fuel, then disappeared. Fuel exhaustion, ditching, and rapid sinking explain all observed facts without introducing additional assumptions. But simplicity is not proof. The lack of wreckage, despite extensive searches both historical and modern, leaves room for doubt, and doubt, once introduced, is difficult to eliminate. In 1940, British colonial officer Gerald Gallagher discovered human bones on Gardner Island, now Nicumaroro, approximately 350 miles southeast of Howland. The bones were examined by Dr. David Hoodless, who concluded they belonged to a male. They were subsequently lost, but in 1998, forensic anthropologists re-examined Hoodless's measurements and suggested the bones were more consistent with a woman of Earhart's height and build. The International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, TIGHAR, has led multiple expeditions to Nicumaroro, finding artifacts including a piece of plexiglass that might match the Electra's windows and what could be remnants of a castaway camp. Nicumaroro is a coral atoll roughly 400 miles southeast of Howland Island, approximately 2 hours of flight time in the Electra. In 1937, the island was uninhabited but had been visited periodically by British colonial administrators and was noted on navigation charts. The island features a fringing reef that becomes exposed at low tide, creating a relatively flat surface that could theoretically serve as an emergency landing strip. If Earhart had been unable to locate Howland and was running critically low on fuel, Nicumaroro might have appeared as a viable alternative. The discovery of human remains in 1940 was made during a colonial survey. Gerald Gallagher, a British administrative officer, was leading a group to assess the island's suitability for settlement. On the island's southeast end, his team found partial skeletal remains near what appeared to be an old campsite. The bones were fragmentary, a skull, some limb bones, parts of a rib cage, suggesting they had been exposed to the elements and possibly disturbed by animals. Gallagher sent the bones to Fiji for analysis, where Dr. David Hoodless examined them and recorded measurements. Hoodless's analysis was brief and preliminary. Based on the measurements he recorded, he concluded the bones belonged to a male of European ancestry, approximately 5'5" tall. The bones were then lost, possibly discarded, possibly misplaced in storage. Hoodless's written measurements survived in colonial records, but the physical evidence vanished. For decades, this appeared to be a dead-end, bones found, examined, determined to be male, therefore not Earhart. But in 1998, forensic anthropologists Richard Jantz and Karen Burns re-examined Hoodless's original measurements using modern forensic techniques. They found significant problems with his analysis. The measurement methods Hoodless used were outdated even in 1940, and his conclusions about sex determination were based on criteria that modern forensics consider unreliable. When Jantz applied modern forensic standards to the measurements, accounting for population variation and measurement uncertainty, he concluded the bones were more consistent with a female of Northern European ancestry, with proportions matching Earhart's known physical characteristics. TIGHAR, founded by Richard Gillespie in 1985, has made Nikumaroro the focus of over a dozen expeditions. Their investigations have uncovered several intriguing artifacts. A fragment of plexiglass was found that appears consistent with the type used in Electra cockpit windows. A piece of aluminum with rivet patterns similar to those used in Lockheed aircraft was discovered. Parts of a woman's shoe, specifically a heel and leather fragments, were found that matched the style Earhart was known to wear. A small bottle that could have contained freckle cream, a product Earhart used, was recovered from a site that showed evidence of campfires. The hypothesis suggests that Earhart made an emergency landing on Nikumaroro's reef at low tide, then survived for some period as a castaway before succumbing to injury, dehydration, or disease. The aircraft would have been destroyed by tidal action and storms, with pieces washing into the ocean or being scattered along the beach. The wreckage, predominantly aluminum, would have been lightweight enough for waves to carry away. Within weeks or months, physical evidence of the plane would have largely disappeared, but each piece of evidence discovered on Nikumaroro has alternative explanations. Nikumaroro was uninhabited in 1937, but was known to British authorities. The island has a coral reef that could have served as a landing strip during low tide. TIGHAR's investigations uncovered what appeared to be fire pits, possible aircraft debris, and a fragment of a woman's shoe that matched the style Earhart was known to wear. In 1940, a message in a bottle reportedly found on the island suggested castaways had been there. Radio signals claiming to be from Earhart were reportedly received by amateur operators for days after the disappearance. Though many of these have been debunked as hoaxes or misidentifications, the physical evidence from Nikumaroro is intriguing but circumstantial. The plexiglass fragment could have come from any aircraft or boat that visited the island in the decades since Earhart's disappearance. The aluminum piece might be from the Electra, but it might equally be from one of the Coast Guard vessels that searched the Phoenix Islands in 1937, or from later military or civilian activity. The shoe fragments match Earhart's style, but similar shoes were common in the 1,930 seconds and could have belonged to anyone who visited the island. The fire pits discovered on the island's southeast end are more suggestive. Excavations reveal charcoal and burned bonefish and bird remains concentrated in several locations near where the human bones were found. The arrangement suggests repeated use over weeks or months, consistent with someone living as a castaway. But the island was visited periodically by colonial administrators, and Polynesian voyagers may have stopped there centuries earlier. Dating the fire pits conclusively to 1937 has proven difficult. Perhaps the most controversial evidence involves radio signals. In the days and weeks following Earhart's disappearance, dozens of amateur radio operators around the world reported receiving distress messages they believed came from her. Some messages included her call sign, KHAQQ. Others mentioned being on a reef or island. A few provided coordinates or descriptions. The U.S. Navy investigated many of these reports at the time, but most were quickly dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications of other broadcasts. However, some signals remain unexplained. A teenage girl in Florida, named Betty Klenk, reported hearing clear distress calls on her shortwave radio on July 2nd and 3rd. She transcribed the messages, which mentioned being on land and needing help. Her notebook, preserved for decades, shows details that seem consistent with Earhart's situation. But experts note that atmospheric conditions in 1937 would have made it nearly impossible for a low-power radio transmission from a downed aircraft to reach Florida. The physics doesn't support the possibility. Tigger has proposed that if the Electra landed on Nicumaroro's reef, the aircraft's radio might have functioned briefly when the engines could be run to charge the batteries. The flat reef would have acted as a ground plane, potentially extending radio range. During specific tidal and atmospheric conditions, signals might have propagated across the Pacific. This would explain why some signals were received days after the disappearance. Earhart was alive on the island, periodically running the engines to send distress calls. The theory has dramatic appeal. It transforms Earhart's death from an instant tragedy to a prolonged ordeal, suggesting she survived for days or weeks as a castaway, perhaps within sight of aircraft that couldn't see her, sending desperate radio signals that went unanswered. It's a narrative that resonates emotionally, even as it strains credibility physically. Recent expeditions have used increasingly sophisticated technology. Ground-penetrating radar has mapped anomalies beneath the sand. Forensic dogs trained to detect old human remains have alerted at specific locations. Underwater sonar has searched the reef slope for wreckage. Each technology promises definitive answers, but each delivers only ambiguous results, anomalies that might be significant or might be natural geological features. The evidence from Nicumaroro is suggestive but not conclusive, compelling but not definitive. The bones found on Nicumaroro were sent to Fiji for analysis and then lost, a frustrating gap in the historical record. In 2018, a University of Tennessee study used modern forensic methods to reanalyze Dr. Hoodless's original measurements and concluded with high probability that the bones belonged to someone matching Earhart's physical profile. Critics argue the measurements were too imprecise for definitive identification, and without DNA evidence, the case remains circumstantial. The debate over these bones has become one of the most contentious aspects of the entire mystery. The loss of the bones represents one of the most frustrating aspects of the Earhart mystery. Physical remains could provide definitive answers through DNA analysis, isotope studies, and modern forensic techniques. Instead, researchers are left analysing measurements recorded on a colonial form by a doctor, using methods that were already considered outdated in 1940. The measurements themselves are ambiguous, some clearly recorded, others estimated, some potentially transcribed incorrectly. Dr. Richard Jantz's 2018 reanalysis applied modern forensic anthropology methods to Hoodless's measurements. Jantz used a statistical program called FORDISC, which compares skeletal measurements against databases of known individuals from various populations. When he entered Hoodless's measurements, the program suggested the bones were more consistent with a white female of European ancestry than with a male. Specifically, the bone proportions matched Earhart's known physical characteristics, height, build, and limb proportions more closely than they matched the general male population. Jantz went further, obtaining historical photographs of Earhart and using specialized software to estimate skeletal proportions from body proportions visible in the photos. This technique, called photogrammetry, can provide approximate skeletal measurements from living individuals. When Jantz compared these estimates to Hoodless's measurements, he found striking similarities. The radius to humerus ratio, a measurement relatively consistent across individuals, matched closely. The estimated femur length was within the range of Hoodless's measurements. The statistical probability that the bones belonged to someone with Earhart's proportions was calculated at over 99%. Critics of Jantz's work raise several objections. First, Hoodless's measurements may contain errors. His methods were imprecise, and some measurements appear inconsistent with each other, suggesting mistakes in recording or transcription. Second, the measurements are incomplete. Several key bones that would provide more definitive sex determination were not measured or not recorded. Third, the statistical analysis depends on comparison populations that may not be appropriate. Earhart's ancestry and physical characteristics may not match the reference populations used in the analysis. More fundamentally, critics argue that even if the bones did belong to a woman of Earhart's approximate size and proportions, that doesn't prove they were Earhart's bones. Many women matched those general characteristics. Without DNA evidence, the identification remains inferential rather than definitive. The statistical probability, while high, is not the same as physical proof. The debate has become polarized, with Tigger supporters viewing Jantz's analysis as near-conclusive proof and skeptics dismissing it as statistical overreach. Both sides accuse the other of confirmation bias, favoring the Niku-Mororo hypothesis, or reflexive skepticism, rejecting any evidence that challenges the crash and sink theory. The truth likely lies somewhere between, in the uncomfortable territory where evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The possibility remains that the bones could be found. Colonial records are incomplete, and the bones might have been stored rather than discarded. Some researchers hold out hope that a comprehensive search of museum storage facilities or forgotten archives in Fiji might yet locate them. Modern DNA analysis could settle the question definitively, comparing genetic material from the bones to DNA from Earhart's living relatives. But until that discovery occurs, if it ever does, the bones controversy will remain exactly what it is. A tantalizing possibility supported by reanalyzed measurements and challenged by the absence of physical proof. The mystery continues, unresolved. The Japanese capture hypothesis. Another theory suggests Earhart and Noonan were captured by the Japanese military after crash landing in the Marshall Islands. This theory gained traction after World War II, when some witnesses claimed to have seen a white woman and a man being held prisoner on Saipan in the Mariana Islands. According to this narrative, the pair were suspected of being American spies and were either executed or died in captivity. Some variations of this theory claim they were taken to Tokyo and held in secret detention. The Japanese capture hypothesis emerged in the 1,960 decades after Earhart's disappearance, as journalists and researchers interviewed Pacific Islanders who had lived under Japanese occupation. The Marshall Islands, located roughly 800 miles northwest of Howland Island, were under Japanese mandate in 1937. If Earhart had veered significantly off course, either due to navigation error or deliberately seeking an alternative landing site, she could theoretically have reached the Marshalls with remaining fuel. The theory proposes that Earhart and Noonan crash-landed or made an emergency landing in the Marshall Islands, possibly on Atoll or Jaluit Atoll. Japanese military personnel stationed there would have immediately detained any foreign nationals, particularly Americans operating an aircraft in what Japan considered its territorial waters. In the increasingly tense pre-war climate of 1937, with Japan expanding militarily throughout the Pacific, the arrival of two Americans in an advanced aircraft would have been viewed with extreme suspicion. According to the hypothesis, Earhart and Noonan were transported to Saipan in the Mariana Islands, where Japan maintained a significant military presence. Saipan served as an administrative center for Japanese Pacific operations and housed detention facilities. The pair would have been interrogated, accused of espionage, and ultimately either executed as spies or died from disease or mistreatment during imprisonment. Their aircraft would have been examined by Japanese military engineers, then either destroyed or transported to Japan for further analysis. The theory gained momentum through the work of several researchers, most notably CBS correspondent Fred Gardner, who spent years investigating and wrote the book The Search for Amelia Earhart in 1966. Gardner interviewed dozens of witnesses and excavated multiple sites on Saipan based on testimony about graves or crash sites. His work inspired others, creating a substantial body of research arguing for the Japanese capture scenario. Proponents note that Japan had strong incentives to conceal Earhart's capture, admitting they had detained and possibly executed America's most famous female aviator would have created an international incident and potentially accelerated US military involvement in the Pacific. After World War II, with Japan under occupation and war crimes being prosecuted, any surviving records of Earhart's detention might have been deliberately destroyed to avoid embarrassment or legal consequences. The theory's appeal lies partly in its dramatic narrative. Earhart as prisoner, rather than accident victim, her fate determined by international politics rather than navigation error. It transforms her disappearance from tragedy to conspiracy, suggesting government cover-ups and hidden records. But dramatic narratives require extraordinary evidence, and the Japanese capture hypothesis depends largely on eyewitness testimony, given decades after the supposed events. without supporting documentation or physical evidence. The search for that evidence has led researchers down numerous paths, some promising, most ultimately frustrating. In the 1,960 seconds, CBS correspondent Fred Gardner interviewed dozens of Saipan residents who claimed to have seen Earhart and Noonan. Their testimonies varied, but common threads emerged. A white woman pilot, a male companion, Japanese soldiers, and ultimately, execution. Some witnesses described seeing a plane matching the Electra's description. When Gardner and investigators excavated sites based on these accounts, they found nothing conclusive. Critics argue the witnesses may have confused timelines or been influenced by post-war rumours. The witness testimonies collected by Gardner and subsequent researchers paint a consistent general picture but diverge on crucial details. Several Saipan residents claim to have seen a white woman and a man in Japanese custody in 1937. Some described the woman as having short hair and wearing pants unusual for women at the time, and consistent with Earhart's typical appearance. The man was described as tall and thin, matching Noonan's build. These witnesses placed the prisoners at various locations around Saipan, including the military headquarters and detention facilities. One frequently cited witness was Josephine Blanco Akiyama, who was a child on Saipan in the 1,930 seconds. She claimed to have seen a white woman and man under guard near the old Japanese jail. The woman appeared disheveled and distressed. Akiyama's testimony was specific about the location and included details about the woman's appearance that matched Earhart. She maintained her story consistently across multiple interviews over several decades, lending it credibility in the eyes of some researchers. Other witnesses described seeing an aircraft that matched the Electra's description, a twin-engine silver plane either crashed on the island or being transported to a hangar. Some claimed the aircraft was later burned or dismantled by Japanese forces. A few witnesses reported hearing about executions of American prisoners, though none claimed to have witnessed executions directly. The testimonies suggested the prisoners died either from execution, disease, or dysentery. Sometime in 1937 or early 1938. The problem with eyewitness testimony, particularly testimony given 25 to 30 years after alleged events, is its unreliability. Memory is malleable, subject to suggestion, contamination from other sources, and unconscious fabrication. Witnesses interviewed in the 1,960 seconds had lived through World War II, during which Saipan saw intense combat and American occupation. They had been exposed to decades of rumours and speculation about Earhart. Many had heard about Gardner's investigation before being interviewed, potentially contaminating their memories with suggested details. Excavations based on witness testimony yielded frustratingly ambiguous results. At one location, where witnesses claimed Earhart and Noonan had been buried, investigators found human bones. Initial analysis suggested they might be Caucasian, but proper forensic examination determined they were Japanese remains, probably from the wartime period. At another site where witnesses remembered seeing aircraft wreckage, excavations found metal fragments, but none could be definitively linked to the Electra. Japanese records from the pre-war period in the Marshall Islands and Marianas are incomplete. Many documents were destroyed during the war, either by bombing or by deliberate Japanese action to prevent them from falling into American hands. Post-war, the US. Occupation government made efforts to collect and preserve Japanese military records, but systematic documentation of prisoner detention or aircraft seizures has never been found. The absence of records is not proof the events didn't occur, but it's also not proof they did. Perhaps most damaging to the witness testimony is the lack of contemporary documentation. If Earhart had been captured by Japanese forces in 1937, it would have been an event of considerable significance, even if kept secret from the outside world. Internal Japanese military communications, reports to Tokyo, or administrative records would have been generated. None have been found despite extensive searches of Japanese archives, including records seized after the war and held by US intelligence agencies. The witnesses may have seen something, perhaps other Western prisoners, perhaps aircraft from later periods, perhaps events distorted by time and memory into something that seemed to match Earhart's story. But testimony alone, without corroborating evidence, cannot establish historical fact. In 2017, a photograph allegedly taken at Jaluit Atoll in the Marshall Islands surfaced. purportedly showing Earhart and Noonan alive after their disappearance. The photo, discovered in the National Archives, shows a dock with several figures, including what some claimed was a woman resembling Earhart and a man resembling Noonan. Japanese military personnel are also visible. However, subsequent investigation revealed the photo had been published in a Japanese travelogue in 1935, 2 years before Earhart's flight. The theory collapsed, but the photo's initial publicity reignited interest in the Marshall Islands hypothesis. The photograph's discovery created international headlines. Found in the National Archives by a former US Treasury agent named Les Guinea, the image appeared to show a dock scene in Jaluit Atoll. Among the figures visible in the photo, researchers identified what they claimed was a woman sitting on the dock with her back to the camera, with short hair and wearing pants. On a nearby barge, a figure resembling Fred Noonan appeared to be present. The History Channel produced a documentary, Amelia Earhart, The Lost Evidence, featuring the photograph prominently. Facial recognition experts analysed the figures, claiming the proportions matched Earhart and Noonan with reasonable probability. If authentic and correctly dated, the photograph would provide visual evidence that Earhart and Noonan had reached the Marshall Islands alive and were in Japanese custody. It would validate decades of witness testimony and transform the capture hypothesis from speculation to documented fact. But skeptics immediately questioned the photograph's provenance and dating. The National Archives catalogue listed it as part of a collection with minimal documentation, no date, no photographer attribution, no context beyond Marshall Islands. The assumption that it was taken in 1937 was based entirely on the belief that it showed Earhart and Noonan. If it didn't show them, then the date was entirely uncertain. This circular reasoning troubled historians. Within weeks of the documentary's broadcast, Japanese military history blogger Kota Yamano made a devastating discovery. He found the same photograph published in a 1935 Japanese travel book about the South Pacific. The book, Naval Lifeline: History of the South Seas, contained the image with a caption identifying it as Jaluit Harbour. The publication date was definitively 1935, 2 years before Earhart's disappearance. The photograph could not possibly show Earhart and Noonan. The History Channel issued a statement acknowledging the error and pulling the documentary from further broadcast. The facial recognition analysis was revealed to be less definitive than initially presented. The experts had been working from low-resolution images and couldn't conclusively identify anyone in the photograph. The figure thought to be Earhart could have been any of numerous women in the Marshall Islands in the 1930 seconds. The supposed aircraft on the barge didn't match the Electra's configuration when examined more closely. The episode demonstrated the dangers of confirmation bias in historical research. Investigators looking for evidence of Earhart in the Marshall Islands found what they wanted to see in an ambiguous photograph. They built a narrative around the image without thoroughly investigating its provenance. The desire to solve the mystery overwhelmed critical analysis, leading to a very public embarrassment when the photograph's true date was discovered. Yet despite the photograph's debunking, it did serve one purpose. It brought renewed attention to the Marshall Islands hypothesis and prompted new research. Some investigators began looking more carefully at Japanese language sources and archives, searching for any documentary evidence of unusual events in the Marshalls in mid-1937. Others renewed efforts to interview aging witnesses who might remember details from that period. The photograph was false, but the attention it generated led to legitimate research that continues today. The incident also highlighted the challenges facing Earhart researchers. With so few physical artifacts and so much speculation, any new evidence attracts immediate attention and intense scrutiny. Some researchers believe Earhart's flight was a cover for a US spy mission to photograph Japanese military installations in the Pacific. According to this theory, President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved a covert reconnaissance operation disguised as a round-the-world flight. The Electra was supposedly equipped with cameras, and the route was deliberately planned to pass near Japanese-held islands. Earhart's disappearance, in this version, was either a navigational error during the spy mission or the result of being shot down by Japanese forces. The spy mission theory emerged during the Cold War era, when conspiracy theories about government cover-ups were culturally resonant. Proponents argue that Earhart's celebrity made her the perfect cover for espionage. Who would suspect America's most famous female pilot of conducting military reconnaissance? The theory suggests that Roosevelt, increasingly concerned about Japanese military expansion in the Pacific, needed intelligence about fortifications on Japanese-held islands, but couldn't send obvious military reconnaissance aircraft without provoking an international incident. According to this narrative, Earhart was approached either directly by Roosevelt or through intermediaries, and agreed to allow her flight to serve dual purposes. The Electra would be modified to carry cameras capable of photographing islands and installations from altitude. Her planned route conveniently passed near several Japanese-mandated territories, including the Marshall, Caroline, and Mariana Islands. While ostensibly flying from Lae to Howland, she would deviate slightly from the direct route to overfly Japanese positions, photographing them before continuing to her stated destination. The theory attempts to explain several puzzling aspects of the flight. Why was the Electra so heavily modified, with significant weight removed, perhaps to accommodate camera equipment and film? Why did Earhart remove the 500 kHz radio equipment that would have improved her chances of finding Howland? Perhaps because government-supplied communication equipment was installed instead. Why was the flight funded partly by government agencies? Perhaps because it was secretly a military operation. Every ambiguity in the historical record becomes potential evidence of conspiracy. Some versions of the theory suggest Earhart was shot down by Japanese forces who detected her unauthorized overflight of their territory. Her disappearance becomes not an accident but an act of war, covered up by both governments to avoid escalating tensions. Other versions propose she completed her spy mission successfully but ran out of fuel on the return leg, leading to the same result loss over the Pacific but for different reasons. In this telling, the US government knows what happened but maintains silence to protect intelligence operations. The spy theory received renewed attention in the 2000s, when some researchers claimed to have found evidence of camera equipment modifications to similar Electra aircraft from the same era. They argued that the mounting points and structural modifications visible in photographs of Earhart's plane were consistent with camera installations. However, aviation historians pointed out that these modifications were actually fuel tank mounts, exactly as documented in maintenance records, with no mysterious purpose. Proponents also cite Earhart's connections to the Roosevelt administration. She was friendly with Eleanor Roosevelt and had visited the White House on multiple occasions. She had participated in government aviation initiatives and served as a consultant on aviation matters. These connections, the theory suggests, provided the channel through which she would have been recruited for intelligence work. Her commitment to advancing aviation and proving women's capabilities might have made her receptive to a request framed as serving national interests. The theory's appeal lies in transforming Earhart from victim of circumstance to active agent in international affairs. It elevates her disappearance from tragic accident to meaningful sacrifice in the gathering storm that would become World War II. It provides purpose and significance to her death beyond simple navigation failure, but appeal is not evidence, and significance is not proof. Proponents point to Earhart's friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt and her connections to military officials as evidence of government involvement. They note that the Electra's flight path did pass near contested Pacific territories. However, no documentary evidence has ever emerged showing Roosevelt or any government agency authorized such a mission. Earhart's own writings and communications show a woman focused on aviation records, not espionage. Most historians dismiss the spy theory as Cold War-era speculation with no factual foundation. The spy theory's greatest weakness is its complete absence of documentation. Presidential administrations generate extensive paper trails, memos, authorizations, budget allocations, personnel assignments, and operational plans. Intelligence operations, even covert ones, leave records. The U.S. government declassified vast quantities of World War II-era intelligence documents in the decades following the war, including many highly sensitive operations. None mention Earhart or any operation involving her flight. The Freedom of Information Act has enabled researchers to request and examine classified documents from the Roosevelt administration and military intelligence services. Multiple researchers have filed FOIA requests seeking any records related to Earhart and intelligence operations. The responses have been uniformly negative. No such records exist in government archives. The National Archives, the Roosevelt Presidential Library, Naval Intelligence Archives, and Army Intelligence files contain no evidence of Earhart conducting espionage. Defenders of the spy theory argue this absence proves a cover-up rather than disproving the theory. They suggest records were deliberately destroyed or remain classified under national security exemptions. But this argument requires believing in a conspiracy so effective that it left absolutely no documentary trace across multiple agencies and administrations spanning 80 years. It requires believing that everyone involved, intelligence officers, military personnel, government officials, maintained perfect secrecy, despite having no reason to do so after the war ended and most participants died. Earhart's own writings and communications contradict the spy theory. Her letters to her husband, her public statements, her private journals all consistently describe a woman motivated by aviation achievement and women's advancement. She wrote extensively about her goals for the flight, her preparation process, her concerns about equipment and weather. Nothing in her writings suggests awareness of any covert mission. Unless we believe she maintained perfect operational security, even in private communications, an implausible level of tradecraft for someone with no intelligence training, her own words disprove the theory. The logistics of the supposed spy mission also don't withstand scrutiny. Aerial reconnaissance in 1937 required specialized cameras, large format film, and expert operation. The Electra would need significant modifications to accommodate such equipment. Modifications that would be obvious to the many mechanics and engineers who worked on the aircraft. Camera operation would require training that Earhart would have needed to receive somewhere. From someone. Film would need to be developed and analysed after the flight. None of these logistical requirements show any evidence of having occurred. Furthermore, the route Earhart actually flew didn't optimise for photographing Japanese installations. Her path from Leh to Howland was the most direct route, passing hundreds of miles south of the Marshall Islands. To photograph Japanese facilities would have required a significant northward deviation, burning fuel she couldn't spare. The theory requires believing she planned a detour that her fuel calculations couldn't support. Military historians also note that by 1937, the US Navy was already conducting reconnaissance of Japanese-held territories using Navy aircraft and submarines. They had better intelligence capabilities than anything Earhart could have provided with a civilian aircraft and improvised camera equipment. The military had no operational need for her assistance, making the entire premise unnecessary. The spy theory persists not because of evidence, but because of narrative appeal and distrust of government. It offers a version of Earhart's story where she was more than a pilot. She was a patriot conducting dangerous work for her country. It suggests her disappearance had meaning beyond accident, and it allows believers to feel they've uncovered hidden truth that the government doesn't want revealed. These psychological appeals ensure the theory's survival despite historical evidence firmly rejecting it. Sometimes, the simplest explanation really is correct. Earhart was attempting a dangerous flight with minimal safety margins. She encountered problems, navigation difficulties, communication failures, adverse weather. The flight ended in tragedy. No conspiracy necessary. The radio logs from the Itasca provide some of the most detailed evidence of Earhart's final hours. The logs show that Earhart transmitted multiple times, but never acknowledged receiving any messages from the ship. This suggests either a receiver failure on the Electra, or that Earhart was transmitting on one frequency while listening on another. Modern analysis of the logs indicates Earhart was likely very close to Howland Island during her final transmissions, possibly within 100 miles. The running north and south message suggests she was flying a search pattern, burning precious fuel while trying to locate the island visually. The Itasca's radio operators meticulously documented every transmission they received and every message they sent. The logs reveal a pattern of increasing frustration as communication remained stubbornly one way. Chief radioman Leo Bellots and his team tried multiple frequencies, varied their transmission schedules, and attempted every protocol they could think of to establish two-way contact. Nothing worked. Earhart transmitted, but she never acknowledged hearing their responses. The signal strength measurements recorded in the logs provide crucial information about Earhart's distance from Howland. Radio signal strength decreases predictably with distance, and the Itasca's operators noted the relative strength of each transmission they received. The earliest messages were weak and broken, barely audible above static. As the morning progressed, the signals grew steadily stronger, indicating Earhart was approaching the island. By 7:42 a.m., when she reported, "We must be on you but cannot see you." The signal was strong and clear, what radio operators would classify as S5, indicating excellent reception. This signal strength suggests Earhart was probably within 100 miles of Howland Island, possibly closer. At that distance, on a clear day, an island should be visible from altitude, but Earhart's own transmissions reported cloudy and overcast conditions. Scattered clouds could easily hide a small island, creating a situation where an aircraft could pass within miles of its destination without the crew ever seeing it. The frustration in Earhart's voice was audible. Even through the static, she believed she was at the right location, but visual confirmation eluded her. The running north and south message has been analysed exhaustively. The line of position, Earhart reported 157 to 337 degrees, passes directly through Howland Island. This line would have been calculated by Noonan from a celestial observation, probably a sun sight taken at dawn. The line tells him they're somewhere along that bearing, but not where on the line they're located. By flying perpendicular to the line north and south, they should have crossed Howland Island's location. The technique is sound, but it requires accurate initial positioning and sufficient fuel to complete the search pattern. Modern analysis suggests Earhart may have been slightly east or west of Howland when she began her north-south search pattern. If she was even 30 or 40 miles off, she might have flown parallel to the island rather than across it, passing within sight distance but never close enough to see it through the clouds. Each mile flown in the search pattern burned fuel, narrowing the window for finding the island before the engine stopped. The radio logs also document something else: the Itasca's increasing alarm as transmissions continued without acknowledgement. Commander Thompson's marginal notes on the logs show his growing realization that communication was failing catastrophically. His attempts to help were useless without two-way contact. He was listening to a tragedy unfold in real time, powerless to prevent it. The last entry in the log, at 8:43 a.m., simply notes: signal, strength, S5, no further contact. After that, silence. The operators continued listening, continued transmitting, continued hoping. To understand how experienced aviators could miss a tiny island, we must consider the navigation technology of 1937. Noonan relied primarily on celestial navigation, using a sextant to measure the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon and calculate position. This method required clear skies and precise time measurements. Cloud cover, which Earhart reported, would have made celestial navigation difficult or impossible. The Electra was equipped with a radio direction finder, but Earhart had left behind a critical trailing antenna in Miami. Because it was cumbersome, without it, her ability to use radio navigation was severely compromised. Celestial navigation in 1937 was more art than science, requiring skill, experience, and favourable conditions. The Navigator would use a sextant to measure the angle between a celestial body, the sun, moon, or a star, and the horizon. This measurement, combined with precise time from a chronometer and data from navigation tables, allowed calculation of a line of position. The aircraft was somewhere along that line, but its exact position on the line remained uncertain without a second observation from a different celestial body. Noonan was exceptionally skilled at celestial navigation, having refined his techniques over years of trans-Pacific flights with Pan American Airways. But even expert navigation required cooperation from the weather. Cloud cover between the aircraft and the horizon made sextant readings impossible. Overcast skies obscured the sun and stars. Turbulence made holding the sextant steady difficult, introducing errors into measurements. A difference of just 1 degree in a sunsight could translate to a position error of 60 nautical miles. The flight from Leh to Howland crossed the international dateline and spanned multiple time zones, complicating chronometer management. Noonan needed to maintain precise time to correlate his celestial observations with the sun's known position. Any error in time, even a few seconds, would propagate through his calculations and result in position errors. The chronometers available in 1937 were mechanical devices, subject to temperature variations and vibration that could affect their accuracy over long flights. Dead reckoning estimating position based on heading, airspeed, and elapsed time filled gaps when celestial navigation was impossible. Wind speed and direction had to be estimated or calculated from drift observations. Airspeed indicators were less accurate than modern instruments. Compass readings required correction for magnetic variation and deviation. Each of these factors introduced small errors that compounded over hours of flight, potentially placing the aircraft miles from its calculated position. The radio direction finder could have partially compensated for these limitations, but only if it functioned properly. The system required the trailing wire antenna to provide adequate signal reception. Without it, the direction finder's range and accuracy were severely limited. Even with the antenna, the system was temperamental atmospheric conditions, static from thunderstorms, and the aircraft's own electrical systems could interfere with readings. The Itasca's radio signal wasn't strong enough for reliable direction finding at long range, meaning the system would only become useful when Earhart was already relatively close to the island. Modern GPS navigation has made it difficult to appreciate how challenging long-distance navigation was in 1937. Today's pilots enter coordinates, and computers guide them with meter-level accuracy. In Earhart's era, navigation required continuous calculation, estimation, and correction. A single-degree error in course, maintained over several hours, could place an aircraft 50 or more miles from its intended position. Weather deviations, fuel conservation maneuvers, and search patterns all introduced additional navigation complexity. Finding Howland Island required threading a needle arriving at precisely the right location. After 2,500 miles of flight over featureless ocean, with navigation tools that provided approximate rather than exact positions, the margin for error was essentially zero. Noonan's navigation had to be perfect, the weather had to cooperate, and the radio systems had to function flawlessly. When any of these factors failed, the probability of locating a target 1.6 miles long dropped precipitously. The wonder isn't that Earhart missed Howland Island. The wonder is that anyone in that era successfully found such small targets at all. Weather reports from July 2nd, 1937 show scattered clouds and variable winds along Earhart's route to Howland Island. While not extreme, these conditions would have affected fuel consumption calculations. Headwinds would have burned fuel faster than anticipated. Modern meteorological analysis suggests Earhart may have encountered stronger headwinds than forecasted, potentially reducing her fuel reserves just enough to prevent reaching Howland. A difference of just 10 or 15 miles per hour in wind speed could have meant the difference between landing safely and running out of fuel short of the island. Weather forecasting in 1937 bore little resemblance to modern meteorology. Forecasters relied on surface observations from scattered weather stations, ship reports from vessels at sea, and basic understanding of atmospheric dynamics. Satellite imagery didn't exist. Weather radar didn't exist. Computer modeling didn't exist. Forecasts were educated guesses based on limited data, often wrong about details like wind speed, cloud cover, and precipitation timing. The forecasts provided to Earhart before departure from Leh predicted generally favourable conditions. Scattered clouds, moderate winds, no major storms along her route. But moderate winds was a broad category that could encompass significant variation. A forecast of 5 mile per hour headwinds might actually be 25 miles per hour, or might vary from 10 to 30 miles per hour depending on altitude and location. These variations, small in percentage terms, had enormous impact on fuel consumption over an 18-hour flight. The Electra's engines burned approximately 55 gallons of fuel per hour at cruise settings. With 1,100 gallons aboard, Earhart had roughly 20 hours of fuel adequate for the planned 18-hour flight with a 2-hour reserve. But this calculation assumed the forecast winds were accurate. If actual headwinds were 10 miles per hour stronger than forecasted, the aircraft's ground speed would decrease from 150 miles per hour to 140 miles per hour. The flight time would increase proportionally, consuming more fuel. What should have been an 18-hour flight might stretch to 19 or 19.5 hours, eating into the safety reserve. Modern meteorological analysis using historical weather data has attempted to reconstruct conditions along Earhart's route on July 2nd, 1937. Researchers have examined pressure patterns, wind records from nearby weather stations, and ship observations to estimate what winds Earhart actually encountered. The analysis suggests she likely faced headwinds 5 to 10 miles per hour, stronger than forecasted for significant portions of the flight. This seemingly small difference would have increased fuel consumption by roughly 5 to 8%, perhaps 50 to 90 gallons over the course of the flight. That difference could have been catastrophic. If Earhart arrived at Howland's expected location with only 30 or 40 gallons remaining, enough for 30 to 45 minutes of flight, and then couldn't locate the island visually, she would have had very limited time to search before fuel exhaustion. The north-south search pattern she described in her final transmission would have burned fuel rapidly. Each 10 miles flown consumed roughly 6 gallons. A search pattern covering 50 miles north and 50 miles south of her position would consume 60 gallons, potentially all her remaining fuel. Cloud cover exacerbated the problem. Scattered clouds reduced visibility and forced Earhart to descend to stay below the cloud base or climb above it. Either maneuver affected fuel efficiency. Flying low increased air resistance, flying high required leaner fuel mixtures and affected engine performance. The optimal altitude for fuel efficiency was somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 feet. But clouds might have prevented maintaining that altitude consistently. The weather also affected navigation accuracy. Cloud cover interfered with Noonan's celestial observations, as we've discussed, but it also created psychological stress. Hours of flying through clouds or between cloud layers with no visual reference to the horizon or surface is mentally exhausting. The constant instrument scanning, the uncertainty about position, the inability to confirm navigation through visual landmarks, all of this increased cognitive load on both pilot and navigator. The Pacific weather that day wasn't hostile. No typhoons, no severe thunderstorms, no extreme turbulence. But it didn't need to be extreme to be fatal. Marginal weather, slightly worse than forecast, was enough to turn a challenging flight into an impossible one. The difference between success and disaster was measured in single-digit percentages of wind speed variation and a few dozen gallons of fuel. Sometimes, survival isn't about conquering extreme conditions. Sometimes, it's about whether the margins were sufficient for the actual conditions encountered, as opposed to the conditions anticipated. In the decades since Earhart's disappearance, numerous expeditions have searched for wreckage. In 2002, a deep-sea search near Howland Island found nothing. In 2012, TIGA announced sonar images from waters off Nikumaroro, showing an anomaly that might be aircraft wreckage, but subsequent dives found only coral formations. In 2019, Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who discovered the Titanic, led an expedition to Nikumaroro using remotely operated vehicles to search the underwater slopes. The team found no aircraft debris. Each failed search adds to the mystery. The 2002 Nauticos Corporation expedition represented the first serious deep-sea search using modern technology. The team deployed side-scan sonar capable of imaging the ocean floor at depths exceeding 20,000 feet. They surveyed several hundred square miles of seabed in the vicinity of Howland Island, focusing on areas where the Electra might have ditched based on fuel calculations and radio signal analysis. The sonar images revealed an ocean floor dominated by sediment, occasional volcanic features, and scattered debris from more recent shipwrecks. Nothing resembled an aircraft. The negative result was disappointing but not conclusive. The search area, while large, represented only a tiny fraction of the possible search zone. TIGA's work has focused primarily on Nikumaroro, conducting over a dozen expeditions since the 1992. Their 2012 announcement of a sonar anomaly generated significant media attention. The sonar image showed a feature on the underwater reef slope that had geometric characteristics, straight edges, right angles, suggesting human construction rather than natural geology. The feature's size was consistent with an aircraft fuselage. TIGA organized a subsequent expedition with underwater vehicles to investigate, but when divers reached the location, they found only coral-covered rock formations. The straight edges were natural fractures in the basalt substrate. Their geometric appearance, an artifact of the low-resolution sonar imaging. Robert Ballard's 2019 expedition brought the most advanced technology yet deployed in the search. Ballard, who discovered the Titanic in 1985 and has pioneered deep-sea exploration techniques, led a team aboard the research vessel Nautilus. They deployed remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, equipped with high-definition cameras and advanced sonar, searching the steep underwater slopes around Nikumaroro, where wreckage might have slid after the aircraft broke up. The ROVs explored depths from 50 to 1,500 feet, imaging the reef slope in unprecedented detail. The Nautilus expedition found no aircraft debris, but it did reveal how challenging the underwater environment makes searching. The reef slope is covered with coral growth that obscures underlying features. Debris from shipwrecks dating to World War II and earlier periods litters the area, metal fragments, cables, unidentifiable corroded objects creating false positives that require investigation. The underwater topography is complex, with caves, overhangs and crevices where wreckage could be hidden. Even with advanced ROVs and high-resolution imaging, comprehensive searching would require years of effort. Other searches have targeted different locations. In 2017, an expedition searched waters near Howland Island using autonomous underwater vehicles programmed to systematically survey the ocean floor. In 2018, a team investigated reports of wreckage near Buka Island based on local testimony about aircraft debris seen in the 1,940 seconds. In 2020, researchers used satellite imagery analysis to search for anomalies on remote Pacific atolls that might indicate wreckage. All of these efforts found nothing definitively linked to Earhart's Electra. The repeated failures raise an important question. Is the wreckage even findable? Aluminum corrodes in salt water, though slowly. After 85 years underwater, aluminum aircraft components would be heavily degraded, potentially unrecognizable. Ocean currents could have scattered debris over a wide area. Biological growth covers everything in tropical waters within months. If the aircraft ditched in the ocean and sank, the wreckage might be 15,000 feet or more below the surface, in an area of seafloor covering thousands of square miles. Finding it would require both extraordinary technology and extraordinary luck. Each failed search expedition adds data to the historical record while simultaneously deepening the mystery. The negative results don't prove the wreckage doesn't exist. They simply confirm it hasn't been found in the areas searched. The Pacific Ocean is vast beyond human comprehension. An aircraft is tiny by comparison. The mathematics of the search are daunting. Millions of square miles of ocean, depths exceeding 3 miles, technology that can search perhaps a few square miles per day. The search continues not because success seems likely, but because the alternative, accepting that we may never know, is difficult for those invested in solving the mystery. One of the most intriguing pieces of physical evidence is an aluminum panel found on Nikumaroro in 1991. The panel's dimensions and rivet patterns were consistent with patches used on Lockheed Electras, and historical records showed that Earhart's plane had been repaired in Miami before departure. The patch might have matched those repairs. However, the panel disappeared before it could be conclusively matched to Earhart's specific aircraft. Photographs and measurements remain, but without the physical object, definitive analysis is impossible. The missing panel represents both a tantalizing clue and a frustrating dead end. The discovery occurred during a TIGHAR expedition led by researcher Tom King. The team was surveying an area of Nikumaroro's western shore when they found a piece of aluminum partially buried in sand near the high water mark. The panel measured approximately 23 inches by 19 inches, with a distinctive pattern of rivet holes along its edges. The aluminum was thin, typical of aircraft skin rather than structural components, and showed evidence of having been cut to shape rather than formed as a complete panel. What made the panel particularly interesting was its apparent use as a repair patch. The rivet pattern didn't match standard Lockheed manufacturing patterns, suggesting it had been custom fitted to cover damage or replace a damaged section. Historical records documented that Earhart's Electra had undergone repairs in Miami before the eastward attempt, following the damage from the Hawaii ground loop. Maintenance records showed that several panels had been replaced or patched during those repairs. The question was whether this particular panel matched those repairs. TIGHAR researchers photographed the panel extensively and recorded precise measurements of the rivet holes, their diameter, spacing, and pattern. They also noted the aluminum's thickness and the type of rivets that had been used, identified from residual material in the rivet holes. When they compared these measurements to specifications for Lockheed Electra repair patches, they found consistencies. the dimensions fell within the range used for fuselage skin repairs. The rivet spacing matched patterns documented in Lockheed maintenance manuals from the 1,930 seconds. The panel was transported to Fiji for preservation and more detailed analysis. The plan was to conduct metallurgical testing to determine the aluminum alloy composition, which could be compared to materials Lockheed used in 1937. Corrosion patterns might reveal how long the panel had been exposed to saltwater and tropical conditions. If the panel could be definitively matched to Earhart's aircraft, it would provide strong evidence supporting the Nikumaroro hypothesis proof that at least part of the Electra had reached the island. But the panel disappeared before comprehensive testing could be completed. It was stored at a facility in Fiji, awaiting transport to a laboratory in the United States for metallurgical analysis. When researchers returned to retrieve it several months later, the panel could not be located. Despite extensive searching and inquiries, it was never found. Storage facility records were incomplete or lost. No one could definitively say what had happened to it, whether it had been misplaced, stolen, accidentally discarded, or simply lost in administrative confusion. The disappearance left researchers with only photographs and measurements valuable data, but insufficient for definitive identification. Photographs can document appearance but can't reveal alloy composition. Measurements can suggest consistency with Electra specifications, but can't prove this specific panel came from Earhart's specific aircraft. Without the physical object, all conclusions remain circumstantial. Skeptics have questioned whether the panel actually came from an aircraft at all. Nikumaroro was visited by numerous vessels and aircraft over the decades following Earhart's disappearance. During World War II, the island was used as a base for Coast Guard personnel manning a navigation beacon. Aircraft flew over regularly. Boats visited periodically. Any of these could have left metal debris that later washed ashore. The panel might have come from a boat repair, a World War II-era aircraft, or even more recent debris. The missing panel has become emblematic of the entire Earhart mystery, tantalizing evidence that seems to promise answers but ultimately delivers only frustration and continued uncertainty. It represents both the best physical evidence potentially linking Earhart to Nikumaroro and an object lesson in how difficult it is to preserve and analyze evidence from remote locations with limited infrastructure. The photographs remain, archived and analyzed, but photographs can't settle the question definitively. Somewhere, perhaps, the panel still exists misidentified in a storage facility, collected by a private individual, or corroded beyond recognition. Or perhaps it was destroyed, discarded as unimportant debris by someone who didn't understand its potential significance. Either way, without the physical object, its value as evidence remains permanently compromised. In 1937, just months after Earhart's disappearance, British officer Eric Bevington photographed Nikumaroro's coastline during a survey. Modern digital enhancement of that photograph has revealed what some researchers believe could be landing gear protruding from water near the reef. The object's placement and shape are consistent with the Electra's landing gear configuration. Skeptics argue it could be coral, driftwood, or photographic artifact. Without visiting the site at the exact time and tidal conditions when the photo was taken, an impossibility, now the image remains ambiguous. Eric Bevington visited Nikumaroro on November 1st, 1937, as part of a British colonial survey to assess the island's potential for settlement. He was documenting the coastline, harbour conditions, and land features when he took a series of photographs from various angles. These images were filed away in colonial archives, largely forgotten for decades. Bevington had no reason to believe Earhart had reached the island. The prevailing assumption in late 1937 was that she had crashed near Howland Island. His photographs were simply routine documentation of a remote atoll. In the 1,990 seconds, Tigar researchers examining colonial records discovered Bevington's photographs and subjected them to modern digital analysis. One image, showing the western reef area at low tide, became the focus of intense scrutiny. When enhanced and magnified, a blurry object appeared near the waterline in the reef area. The object was geometric rather than organic in appearance, with what looked like vertical and horizontal elements forming a rough triangular shape. Researchers compared the object's apparent dimensions and configuration to photographs of Lockheed Electra landing gear. The Electra's main landing gear was distinctive. a complex assembly of struts, wheels, and hydraulic components that retracted into the engine nacelles during flight. When extended, it formed a characteristic triangular profile when viewed from certain angles. The object in Bevington's photograph, proponents argued, showed remarkable similarity to this configuration. If the Electra had made an emergency landing on the reef, it might have settled at an angle with one landing gear assembly protruding above the waterline. The tidal timing adds another layer of intrigue. Bevington's photograph was taken at low tide, when maximum reef area was exposed. If wreckage rested on the reef in shallow water, low tide would be the only time it might be visible. Subsequent high tides would submerge it completely. This could explain why search aircraft in 1937 saw nothing they might have flown over during high tide when any wreckage was underwater. By the time Bevington photographed the area months later, the wreckage might have shifted position due to storms or tidal action, or might have been partially buried in coral sand. Skeptics have offered numerous alternative explanations. The object could be a coral formation reef. Coral grows in irregular patterns that can appear geometric in low-resolution photographs. It could be driftwood large tree trunks carried to the island by ocean currents, often lodge in reef areas during storms. It could be a rock outcropping or a natural basalt formation, or it could be nothing at all, a photographic artifact created by shadows, water reflections, or grain in the original film. The photograph's resolution is insufficient for definitive identification. Bevington used a simple camera with limitations typical of the 1930 seconds, relatively low resolution, variable focus, and film grain that becomes pronounced when images are enlarged. Digital enhancement can clarify details, but can also create false features through interpolation algorithms. What appears to be a structural element might be merely a shadow enhanced by processing software. Attempts to resolve the ambiguity through comparison photography have proven impossible. The reef environment changes constantly. Coral grows. Storms rearrange sand and debris. The waterline shifts with tidal variations. Visiting the exact location at the same tidal stage wouldn't recreate 1,937 conditions, because the reef itself has changed over 85 years. Any object that was present in 1937 is certainly gone now, either buried under coral growth, broken apart by wave action, or carried into deeper water. The Bevington photograph represents the frustrating nature of historical evidence, suggestive but not conclusive, compelling but not definitive. It offers tantalizing possibilities while remaining stubbornly ambiguous. While Amelia Earhart's fame has overshadowed her Navigator, Fred Noonan's story is equally compelling. Noonan left behind navigational charts and notes that have been studied by modern aviators. His calculations, preserved in archives, show meticulous attention to detail and suggest he was aware of the flight's slim margins for error. Some researchers believe Noonan deliberately charted alternative landing sites in case they missed Howland, which might explain why the Electra ended up far from its intended destination. Noonan's final resting place remains as unknown as Earhart's. Noonan's navigation charts for the Lie to Howland leg, preserved in the archives of Pan American Airways and later donated to research institutions, reveal a navigator who understood exactly what he was attempting. His plots show multiple contingency lines, alternate courses for different wind conditions, and careful notation of the acceptable margins for error. In the margins of some charts, he had written fuel consumption calculations for various scenarios. What if headwinds were 10 miles per hour stronger than forecast? What if they needed to search for Howland? The numbers tell a story of a professional who knew how little room for error existed. One particularly intriguing aspect of Noonan's preparation was his notation of islands southeast of Howland that could serve as emergency landing sites if fuel became critical. The Phoenix Islands, including Nikumaroro, then called Gardner Island, were marked on his charts with distances and bearings from the planned route. Some researchers interpret this as evidence that Noonan had contingency plans, that if they couldn't locate Howland, he might have directed Earhart toward one of these alternative sites, rather than ditching in the ocean. The hypothesis suggests that when Howland failed to appear and fuel became critical, Noonan might have made a calculated decision. Rather than ditch immediately, they could attempt to reach one of the Phoenix Islands. Nikumaroro lay approximately 350 miles southeast, roughly 2 hours of flight time, If they had 30 or 40 gallons of fuel remaining when they abandoned the search for Howland, they might have had just enough to reach an alternative island with a reef flat suitable for emergency landing. This theory would explain several puzzling aspects of the disappearance. It would explain why no wreckage was found near Howland. Despite extensive searching, they weren't near Howland when they went down. It would explain the running north and south message that was their search pattern before abandoning Howland and heading toward an alternative. It would explain why Earhart's final transmissions indicated they were close to land but couldn't see it. They were close to Howland initially, then flew away seeking alternatives. But the theory requires Noonan to have made this decision without communicating it to the Itasca, without sending a message indicating their intention to attempt reaching an alternate island. It requires them to have navigated accurately to a new destination while low on fuel and under extreme stress. And it requires the kind of split-second decision-making that might not have been possible in the final desperate minutes of the flight. Noonan's personal life remains somewhat mysterious. His recent marriage, his struggles with alcohol, his reputation at Pan American Airways, these details have been documented. But his interior life, his thoughts and motivations, remain largely unknown. He left no diary or personal letters describing his feelings about the world flight. His professional communications were terse and technical. We know what he planned and calculated, but not what he felt or feared. His wife, Mary Beatrice Martinelli Noonan, was devastated by his disappearance. She had believed the marriage marked a new beginning for her husband, a chance to rehabilitate his reputation and establish a new career in aviation. His death left her a widow after just 4 months of marriage. She lived until 1973, never remarrying, and rarely spoke publicly about her husband or the circumstances of his loss. Modern aviators who have studied Noonan's work express admiration for his professionalism. His charts are models of careful preparation. His calculations show sophisticated understanding of celestial navigation and dead reckoning. He was, by all technical measures, one of the best navigators of his era. If Fred Noonan couldn't successfully navigate to Howland Island, it says something profound about how challenging the task was, regardless of who attempted it. His legacy is inseparable from Earhart's, but it deserves independent recognition. He wasn't simply the navigator who failed to find Howland Island. He was a pioneering aviator who established trans-Pacific routes still flown today, who developed navigation techniques that advanced the field, and who took on one of the most challenging flights in aviation history, knowing exactly how slim the margins were. He deserves to be found as much as Earhart does. In the days and weeks after Earhart's disappearance, radio operators around the world reported receiving distress signals they believed came from the missing pilot. Some messages claimed to be from Earhart asking for help. Others provided coordinates. The US Navy investigated dozens of these reports, but none led to her. Modern analysis suggests most were hoaxes, misidentifications of other transmissions, or wishful thinking. A few remain unexplained brief, static-filled messages on frequencies Earhart used, received at times when the tides on Nikumaroro would have allowed radio transmission from a grounded aircraft. The phenomenon began within hours of Earhart's last confirmed transmission. Amateur radio operators, caught up in the drama of the disappearance, listened intently on frequencies Earhart had used, hoping to hear her voice. In that heightened state of attention, some heard what they wanted to hear. Static patterns became words. Random transmissions became distress calls. Atmospheric interference became Earhart asking for rescue. The US Navy took these reports seriously initially, investigating each one regardless of how implausible it seemed. Radio direction finding stations attempted to get bearings on reported signals. Ships were diverted to search coordinates mentioned in supposed messages, but as investigations proceeded, nearly all reports proved false. Some were deliberate hoaxes, people seeking attention by claiming to have received messages. Others were genuine misidentifications, radio operators hearing other transmissions and mistakenly believing they were from Earhart. One of the most detailed accounts came from Betty Klenk, a 15-year-old girl in St. Petersburg, Florida, on the evening of July 2nd and morning of July 3rd, 1937, she claimed to have heard clear distress calls on her father's shortwave radio. She transcribed the messages in a notebook, which she preserved for decades. This is Amelia Earhart. KHAQQ. On a coral reef. Plane damaged. Send help. The transcriptions included references to rising water, injury, and desperate pleas for rescue. Klenk's notebook, examined by researchers in recent years, shows details that couldn't have been known to a teenager in Florida unless the transmissions were genuine. But physics presents a significant problem. Radio transmission from a downed aircraft to Florida would require extraordinary propagation conditions. The Electra's radio transmitter was low-powered, designed for line-of-sight or regional communication, not trans-Pacific broadcasting. For signals to reach Florida from the South Pacific would require multiple atmospheric reflections and ideal ionospheric conditions possible but highly unlikely. Most radio engineers believe such transmission was essentially impossible with the Electra's equipment. However, some researchers have proposed a scenario that might explain the signals. If the Electra landed on Nikumaroro's reef with minimal damage, the engines might have been run periodically to charge the batteries and power the radio. The flat reef would act as a ground plane, potentially extending radio range. During specific atmospheric conditions, particularly at night, when ionospheric propagation improves, signals might have propagated across the Pacific through a series of atmospheric skips. It's unlikely, but not impossible. Several other reports came from Pacific locations closer to the potential crash site. Operators in Hawaii, Midway Island, and on Navy ships reported brief transmissions on frequencies Earhart used. Most were too fragmentary to contain useful information, a few words, partial call signs, or simply carrier waves indicating a transmitter was active. The Navy logged these reports but couldn't verify they came from Earhart rather than other sources. The timing of some reports is intriguing. If Earhart landed on a reef during low tide, the aircraft would be above water and potentially operational for several hours until high tide submerged it. Radio transmissions would only be possible during these low tide windows. Some reported signals corresponded to times when Nikumaroro experienced low tide, creating a pattern that some researchers find significant. But others note, this could be coincidental. Low tide occurs roughly twice daily, so any random transmission pattern would occasionally align with tidal cycles. Modern analysis of the radio reports, conducted by researchers using archives of Navy investigation files, suggests that perhaps 3 to 5 reports might have been genuine transmissions from Earhart. The vast majority, over 100 reported signals, were almost certainly hoaxes or misidentifications. The small number of potentially genuine reports remains tantalizing, but unverifiable. Without recordings of the actual signals, without confirmation through direction-finding bearings, without any physical evidence to support them, they remain anecdotal. The radio reports represent humanity's desperate hope that Earhart survived, even briefly, after her last confirmed transmission. The idea that she was alive, sending distress calls that went unanswered, is both compelling and heartbreaking. It transforms her death from instantaneous tragedy to prolonged suffering, from accident to failure of rescue. Perhaps that's why the reports persist in the historical record. Despite their dubious credibility, they offer a narrative of hope, however false that hope may be. Advances in DNA technology have given new hope to solving the mystery. If bones or remains are ever recovered from suspected sites, modern mitochondrial DNA analysis could potentially match them to living relatives of Earhart. In 2018, researchers obtained DNA samples from Earhart's living relatives for comparison purposes. However, without physical remains to test against, the DNA samples remain archived, waiting for archaeological discoveries that may never come. The ocean keeps its secrets well. Mitochondrial DNA analysis has revolutionized forensic identification of old remains. Unlike nuclear DNA, which degrades relatively quickly, mitochondrial DNA is more robust and can persist in bones and teeth for decades or even centuries. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited maternally, passing unchanged from mother to children, which means living maternal relatives can provide comparison samples even generations after someone's death. For Earhart, this means descendants of her mother's family line could provide DNA for comparison. In 2018, as part of preparation for potential discoveries, researchers collected DNA samples from several of Earhart's maternal line relatives. The samples were preserved according to forensic protocols and are stored in research facilities, waiting for the discovery that would make them useful. The process was straightforward. Simple cheek swabs provide sufficient genetic material. The technology is proven and reliable, capable of making definitive identifications from even fragmentary remains. If the bones discovered on Nikomororo in 1940 could be found, DNA analysis could settle the question definitively. Even bones stored for decades in less than ideal conditions can yield usable DNA. Teeth, being denser and more protected than other skeletal elements, are particularly good sources. A single tooth from those lost bones could provide enough material for mitochondrial DNA extraction and analysis. Within weeks, researchers could know with certainty whether the bones belonged to Amelia Earhart, but the bones remain lost. Searches of museum storage facilities in Fiji, where they were sent for analysis, have found nothing. The University of Pennsylvania Museum, which has extensive Pacific collections including material from British colonial surveys, has no record of them. Individual researchers have searched archives, contacted collectors, and followed every possible lead. The bones have simply vanished, likely discarded as unimportant anatomical specimens sometime in the decades after 1940. The possibility remains that other remains might be discovered. If Earhart survived as a castaway on Nikomororo, her remains might still be present on the island, buried in sand or coral rubble. The tropical environment is harsh, high temperatures, high humidity, and aggressive insect life break down organic material quickly. But bones can persist for decades in protected locations. If Earhart died in a sheltered area under vegetation, in a crevice, or in a location where sand covered the remains, skeletal material might still exist. Tihar expeditions have brought forensic anthropologists to Nikomororo to search for burial sites or scattered remains. They've excavated areas near where the 1,940 bones were found, hoping to find additional fragments overlooked in the original discovery. They've used forensic cadaver dogs, animals trained to detect the scent compounds released by decomposing human remains, scents that can persist in soil for decades. The dogs have alerted at several locations, prompting excavations that found animal bones, old campfire sites, and coral fragments, but no human remains. The challenge of searching Nikomororo for remains cannot be overstated. The island is roughly 2.5 miles long and half a mile wide, covered in dense vegetation, sharp coral, and loose sand. A human skeleton, especially one that has been scattered by animals and weathered by decades of tropical storms, might be distributed across a wide area with individual bones buried at various depths. Systematic searching of the entire island would require months of intensive excavation work, expensive, logistically difficult, and with no guarantee of success. Fred Noonan's DNA would require samples from his maternal line relatives. Researchers have attempted to locate Noonan's family descendants, but the trail has proven difficult to follow. Noonan's mother died before his birth, and tracing his maternal lineage back through multiple generations to find living descendants has proven challenging. Without comparative DNA samples, even if remains were discovered and determined to be male, confirming they were Noonan's remains would be impossible without additional evidence. The DNA samples sit in storage, a promise of answers if only the right discovery were made. They represent modern science's ability to solve old mysteries. The potential is there, proven and reliable. But potential means nothing without physical evidence to analyze. Until bones or remains are discovered, the DNA samples are simply waiting, year after year, for archaeological fortune that may never arrive. Earhart's disappearance led to significant improvements in aviation safety and communication protocols. Following the incident, the US government invested heavily in radio navigation infrastructure across the Pacific. Standards for long-distance flight communication were revised. Emergency flotation equipment became mandatory for overwater flights. In a tragic irony, the lessons learned from Earhart's loss may have saved countless lives in the decades that followed, as aviation expanded across the world's oceans. The investigation into Earhart's disappearance identified multiple communication and navigation failures that contributed to the tragedy. The report's recommendations led to concrete changes in aviation regulations and infrastructure. Within a year of the disappearance, the Civil Aeronautics Authority, predecessor to the FAA, had implemented new requirements for overwater flight communications, including mandatory backup radio systems and specific protocols for position reporting. radio navigation infrastructure across the Pacific received substantial investment. The government established additional radio beacon stations on remote islands, creating a network that would guide aircraft across ocean routes that were rapidly becoming commercial aviation corridors. By 1940, Pan American Airways Trans-Pacific routes had reliable radio navigation coverage for the entire journey from California to Asia. Infrastructure that didn't exist when Earhart flew. Communication protocols were standardized and simplified. The confusion about frequencies and transmission schedules that hampered communication between Earhart and the Itasca led to new regulations requiring pre-flight communication plans, with clear schedules, designated frequencies, and backup procedures. Pilots were required to acknowledge received messages and maintain regular contact with ground stations or ships. The one-way communication that characterized Earhart's final hours became unacceptable under new regulations. Emergency equipment requirements were expanded. Aircraft operating over water beyond gliding distance from shore were required to carry life rafts with specified capacity and emergency supplies, flotation gear for all passengers and crew, and emergency radio beacons that would automatically activate if the aircraft ditched. These requirements, now standard across global aviation, trace their origins partly to Earhart's loss and the recognition that inadequate emergency equipment left accident survivors with minimal chance of rescue. The search and rescue response was also reformed. The massive effort to find Earhart revealed gaps in coordination between military services, Coast Guard, and civilian authorities. New protocols established clear chains of command, pre-positioned rescue resources along major flight routes, and improved communication systems for coordinating search operations. The Pacific Search and Rescue Region, one of the world's first formally organized SAR areas, was established partly in response to lessons learned from the Earhart search. Meteorological services for aviation improved dramatically. The recognition that inadequate weather forecasting contributed to navigation difficulties led to expanded weather observation networks, improved forecasting methods, and requirements that long-distance flights receive updated weather information during flight rather than relying solely on pre-flight briefings. By the 1,940 seconds, aviation weather services had become sophisticated operations, providing real-time information to aircraft over oceanic routes. Navigation technology development accelerated. While GPS wouldn't arrive for another 60 years, Earhart's disappearance highlighted the inadequacy of celestial navigation for precise long-distance flight. The development of LORAN, long-range navigation, radio navigation systems during World War II, and later more advanced systems, provided pilots with reliable position information even over featureless oceans. Modern aviation's navigation accuracy owes something to the recognition of how easily even expert navigators could become lost. The cultural impact extended beyond technical improvements. Earhart's disappearance demonstrated that aviation, despite its rapid development, remained dangerous. The public's enthusiasm for aviation records and long-distance flights was tempered by recognition of the risks involved. The era of individual pilots attempting record-breaking flights in marginally adequate aircraft gradually gave way to an emphasis on systematic safety improvement and commercial aviation development. In aviation museums and training facilities today, Earhart's story is used as a case study in risk management and the importance of adequate safety margins. Student pilots learn about the cascade of small problems, communication difficulties, navigation challenges, weather variations that combine to create catastrophic failure. The lesson is that safety depends not on heroism, but on systematic attention to details, adequate redundancy, and proper planning. The irony is inescapable. Earhart's death, tragic and preventable, contributed to making aviation safer for everyone who followed. The improvements implemented because of her loss have saved countless lives over the decades. It's a legacy she never intended and never knew she created, but it endures long after the mystery of her disappearance. Amelia Earhart's disappearance has transcended historical mystery to become cultural mythology. Books, films, and documentaries have explored every angle, some responsibly examining evidence, others venturing into pure speculation. Conspiracy theories have ranged from alien abduction to time travel. While these theories lack credible evidence, they speak to something deeper: humanity's discomfort with uncertainty and our need for narrative closure. Earhart's story became a Rorschach test, reflecting our own fears and fascinations about the unknown. Over 100 books have been written about Earhart's disappearance, each offering different conclusions. Some are meticulously researched historical investigations. Others are thinly veiled fiction, masquerading as fact. Television documentaries appear regularly, each promising new evidence that will finally solve the mystery. The pattern has become predictable. Dramatic announcements, expert analysis, and ultimately ambiguous conclusions that preserve the mystery for future documentaries. The wildest theories reveal more about contemporary anxieties than historical reality. In the 1,950 seconds during UFO hysteria, theories emerged that Earhart had been abducted by aliens, her aircraft supposedly taken by extraterrestrial visitors for study. The 1,980 seconds brought theories involving time travel and parallel dimensions, reflecting that era's fascination with quantum physics and multiverse concepts. These theories lack any factual foundation, but they persist in online communities where speculation thrives unchecked by evidence. More grounded conspiracy theories involve government cover-ups. Some believers argue that the government knows what happened to Earhart, but conceals the truth for political reasons. Perhaps to avoid embarrassment about failed rescue operations, or to protect intelligence secrets, or to maintain diplomatic relations with Japan. These theories require believing in conspiracies lasting 80-plus years, involving hundreds of participants, none of whom ever broke silence despite having no reason for continued secrecy after most players had died. The cultural impact extends beyond conspiracy theories. Earhart has become a feminist icon, her determination to compete equally with men resonating across generations. She appears in children's books as an inspirational figure who refused to accept gender limitations. Her famous quote, "Women must try to do things as men have tried. When they fail, their failure must be but a challenge to others," adorns posters and motivational materials worldwide. Yet this cultural canonization sometimes obscures the human woman behind the icon. Earhart was complex, ambitious but insecure, brave but calculating, idealistic but pragmatic. She made mistakes, including accepting a flight beyond her aircraft's capabilities and her own skill level. The real Earhart, flawed and human, is perhaps more interesting than the mythological figure she's become. The mystery has become self-perpetuating. Each theory generates counter-theories. Each expedition inspires new expeditions. Each book prompts responding books. The lack of resolution ensures continued interest. Perhaps we don't really want the mystery solved. The searching has become more valuable than finding would be. Based on fuel calculations, radio transmissions, and the Itasca's logs, we can reconstruct the Electra's likely final moments. Running low on fuel, unable to spot Howland Island, Earhart would have faced an impossible decision. She could continue searching, burning the last of her fuel with no guarantee of finding the island. Or she could attempt a controlled ditching in the ocean. If she chose the former and reached Nicomaroro or another island, survival would depend on finding water and shelter. If she chose the ocean, survival would have been measured in minutes. At 8:43 a.m., after transmitting her final message about running north and south on line 157 to 337, Earhart faced rapidly deteriorating options. The fuel gauges, if functioning accurately, would have shown tanks nearly empty. She had perhaps 15 to 30 minutes of flight remaining. Maybe less. The decision tree was cruel in its simplicity. Option 1. Continue the search pattern, hoping Howland Island would appear before fuel exhaustion. This offered a chance, small but real, of landing safely and completing the flight successfully. Option 2. Abandon the search immediately and attempt a controlled water landing while fuel remained for maneuvering. This guaranteed failure of the mission but maximized survival chances if ditching could be executed well. Earhart likely flew the search pattern as long as possible, hoping desperately for visual contact with Howland. The psychology of the moment would have been overwhelming. They were close, probably within miles of their destination. Giving up meant accepting that 22,000 miles of successful flight had led to this failure. Human nature resists such acceptance until circumstances force it. When the engines began losing power, the end came quickly. A twin-engine aircraft can't maintain altitude on one engine when the other fails. When both engines quit nearly simultaneously due to fuel starvation, the Electra would have begun descending immediately. Earhart would have a few minutes to establish a glide, aim for a clear area of ocean if possible, and prepare for impact. Ditching an aircraft in ocean swells is extraordinarily difficult. The goal is to contact the water at the slowest possible speed, with wings level and nose slightly up. But judging height above water is nearly impossible without reference points. Most ditchings result in the aircraft striking the water nose first at excessive speed, causing catastrophic structural failure. Even successful ditchings subject occupants to violent deceleration forces that can cause fatal injuries even with restraints. If the Electra struck the water intact, it would have flooded within seconds through shattered windows and breached seams. The life raft, if they could deploy it, might have provided temporary flotation, but in the vast Pacific, temporary meant nothing. They were hundreds of miles from shipping lanes, invisible from more than a few miles away, with no way to communicate their position. The alternative scenario that they reached an island like Nikumaroro offers survival measured in days or weeks rather than minutes. But survival as a castaway on a coral atoll without fresh water or adequate food is its own form of slow death. Dehydration, exposure, and starvation would claim them eventually unless rescue arrived. Either way, the final moments were desperate and terrifying. A conclusion no one deserves, regardless of the risks they chose to accept. The Pacific Ocean floor near Howland Island and surrounding areas remains largely unexplored. Modern bathymetric mapping has revealed a landscape of underwater mountains, trenches and valleys where aircraft wreckage could lie undisturbed. The Electra's aluminum construction means it would corrode slowly in salt water, potentially remaining recognizable for decades or even centuries. Future search technologies advance submersibles, AI-powered image analysis, or new sonar systems might finally locate what human searchers have missed. The bathymetric surveys conducted in recent decades have revealed that the Pacific floor near Howland Island is far more complex than early charts suggested. The seafloor isn't a flat plain, but a landscape of dramatic variation. Volcanic seamounts rising thousands of feet, trenches plunging to abyssal depths, sediment-covered plains interrupted by rock outcroppings. Wreckage could be anywhere in this undersea wilderness, hidden in countless locations where human searchers haven't penetrated. Aluminum corrodes in salt water, but slowly. The Electra's airframe was constructed primarily of aluminum alloy, chosen for its strength-to-weight ratio. In cold, deep ocean water, where oxygen levels are low and temperatures stable, aluminum corrosion proceeds at perhaps a few millimeters per decade. After 85 years, the aircraft's skin might be thinned and weakened, but major structural components, engine mounts, wing spars, landing gear assemblies could remain largely intact and recognizable. The challenge is finding it. Even with modern sonar technology, searching the ocean floor is painstakingly slow. Side-scan sonar can image a strip of seafloor, perhaps 100 meters wide during each pass. To search 1 square kilometer requires dozens of passes. To search the thousands of square kilometers where the Electra might be requires months or years of ship time, expensive and logistically challenging. Commercial vessels with advanced sonar rarely work in remote Pacific areas, where there's no economic incentive for mapping. Future technologies might change the equation. Autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, are becoming more capable and less expensive. Swarms of small AUVs, deployed from a mothership and operating semi-independently, could search large areas more quickly than current methods allow. Artificial intelligence systems trained to recognize aircraft shapes in sonar images could scan data faster than human analysts, identifying potential targets for investigation. Satellite technology offers another possibility. Synthetic aperture radar satellites can sometimes detect underwater features in relatively shallow water by observing surface wave patterns. If the Electra rests in shallow water less than 100 meters deep near Nikumaroro or another island, future satellites with improved resolution might detect it from space. But these technologies require deployment by organizations with sufficient funding and interest. Private expeditions lack resources for comprehensive searches. Government agencies rarely justify the expense for historical investigations when modern search and rescue demands consume available budgets. The economic calculation is harsh. Spending millions to solve an 85-year-old mystery doesn't save lives today, even if it might provide closure for the curious. Perhaps someday, someone will stumble upon the wreckage accidentally. A deep-sea mining operation might encounter unexpected debris. A submarine mapping the ocean floor for scientific purposes might identify an anomaly worth investigating. Such discoveries have occurred before shipwrecks found by chance when no one was looking for them. The ocean is vast, but it doesn't keep every secret forever. Nearly 90 years after Earhart's disappearance, the mystery endures not because we lack theories, but because we lack definitive proof. Every theory has supporting evidence and significant gaps. The crash and sink theory is logical but offers no closure. The Nikumaroro hypothesis has intriguing artifacts, but no conclusive remains. The Japanese capture theory has eyewitness accounts but no documentation. In the absence of absolute proof, we're left with probabilities and possibilities, a reminder that even in the modern age of satellites and sonar, the world can still swallow people whole. The persistence of the Earhart mystery reveals something profound about the limits of knowledge. We live in an era of unprecedented information, access, and technological capability. Satellites photograph every meter of Earth's surface. DNA analysis can identify individuals from microscopic biological samples. Digital archives preserve vast quantities of historical documentation. Yet despite these capabilities, we cannot definitively answer a simple question. The lesson is humbling. Complete knowledge remains impossible. Evidence degrades, memories fade, documents are lost or destroyed. The gaps in what we can know are sometimes insurmountable, regardless of how much we wish otherwise. This realization applies beyond the Earhart mystery to countless historical questions where definitive proof no longer exists, if it ever did. The mystery also teaches us about the nature of evidence and proof. Each theory supporting Earhart's fate presents evidence that seems compelling in isolation, but fails to overcome contrary evidence or explain contradictory facts. The Nikumaroro hypothesis has artifacts that might be from the Electra, but could be from other sources. The witness testimony supporting Japanese capture is detailed but uncorroborated. The crash and sink theory explains the absence of wreckage by proposing it sank in deep water. But that's an explanation, not evidence. This distinction between explanation and proof matters. We can explain almost anything with sufficient creativity. The test of explanation is whether evidence supports it beyond other possible explanations. By that standard, all Earhart theories remain unproven. We have plausible explanations but no definitive proof, and mistaking explanation for proof leads to false certainty. The search for Earhart has consumed enormous resources, millions of dollars, thousands of hours of expert time, decades of research effort. Some argue these resources would be better spent on problems affecting living people rather than solving historical mysteries. Others counter that understanding the past. Even when the stakes are purely historical curiosity represents valid intellectual pursuit, both perspectives have merit. The question is whether society should continue investing in searches that have repeatedly failed when that investment could serve other purposes. Perhaps the real lesson is acceptance, accepting that some mysteries resist solution, that uncertainty is sometimes permanent, that closure isn't always possible. This acceptance doesn't mean abandoning the search or refusing to investigate new evidence. It means recognizing that definitive answers might never come, and that continuing the search is valuable for what we learn in the process, rather than the expectation of eventual success. The Earhart mystery has advanced forensic science, improved underwater search technology, and demonstrated the importance of preserving historical records. These achievements have value, independent of whether they solve the mystery. The journey itself matters, even when the destination remains forever out of reach. What really happened to Amelia Earhart? The question has become inseparable from her legacy, transforming a tragic navigational failure into something larger. A meditation on courage, risk, and the price of pushing boundaries. Perhaps the mystery itself has become more important than the answer. Earhart's disappearance reminds us that some questions may never be answered, that the unknown still exists in our mapped and measured world, and that the line between heroism and tragedy can be as thin as a miscalculation over empty ocean. The search continues, not because we expect to find her, but because the act of searching honours what she represented: the refusal to accept limits, even when those limits prove fatal. On July 2nd, 1937, somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, an aircraft ran out of fuel and fell from the sky. 2 people died: a pilot who had inspired millions, and a navigator who had pioneered transoceanic routes. The basic facts are known. Everything else is speculation, educated guessing, and wishful thinking, shaped into theories that can't quite achieve proof. The simplest explanation, fuel exhaustion, leading to ocean ditching and rapid sinking, remains most probable. It requires no conspiracies, no elaborate alternative narratives, no assumptions beyond what the evidence directly suggests. Earhart was attempting a flight with minimal safety margins. Multiple small problems, communication failures, navigation difficulties, weather variations, combined to create catastrophe. The aircraft went down somewhere in the Pacific, sank quickly, and was never found. Tragic, but comprehensible. Yet, we resist this simple answer. We want Earhart's death to mean something beyond navigational failure. We want evidence and closure, and answers to questions that perhaps have no answers. We want to believe that with sufficient technology and determination, we can solve any mystery. The continuing search for Earhart is partly about finding her, and partly about refusing to accept that some things remain unknowable. The mystery's endurance speaks to Earhart's cultural significance. She represented possibility, the idea that determination and skill could overcome any obstacle, that gender was no barrier to achievement, that the future belonged to those brave enough to seize it. Her disappearance occurred at the moment of apparent triumph. 22,000 miles completed, only 7,000 remaining. The cruelty of that timing transformed her from successful aviator to tragic figure, creating a narrative arc that captures imagination in ways that successful completion never could. Perhaps we search not to find answers, but to maintain connection with what Earhart represented. Each expedition, each investigation, each new theory is an affirmation that courage matters, that pushing boundaries matters, that the attempt itself has value even when it ends in failure. Searching for Earhart becomes a way of honouring those values, keeping them alive through the act of remembering and investigating. The question, what happened to Amelia Earhart, will likely remain unanswered. The ocean keeps its secrets too well. Time has erased too much evidence. The gaps in what we can know have grown too large to bridge. But the searching will continue, generation after generation, because the mystery has become inseparable from the meaning we derive from her life. We search not because we expect to find her, but because the searching itself has become the answer. A perpetual reminder that some boundaries remain beyond us, that some mysteries resist solution, and that the unknown still exists in even the most mapped and measured world. The Pacific remains silent, and perhaps in that silence, there is its own answer